Hey guys, if you were born a Roman Chamberpot washer, you would not be born in a clean place, or even a particularly safe or quiet one. You'd arrive in the world not in a marble-columned villa with dappled sunlight streaming through silk curtains, but rather tucked behind a busy Roman tavern just off the Subura, Rome's most chaotic, grimy, and rumor-filled district, where shouting vendors, drunk centurions, stray dogs, and buzzing flies all blend into a constant, mildly offensive lullaby. You come out feet first, slippery with olive oil and anxiety, while your mother screams into a bundle of stained linen, and your father, already tipsy on bad wine, fumbles for a dull knife to sever the cord. You are small, scrawny, pink as a boiled prawn, and covered in a layer of thick grime before your first breath, thanks to the piles of sawdust, spilled mead, and urine-soaked rags surrounding the birthing mat, which is actually just a reused grain sack. You're born into a working-class Roman family, neither enslaved nor privileged, but stuck somewhere between dirt and dung on the great ladder of the empire's social structure. Your family's occupation, passed down with quiet resignation, like a rusty heirloom, is chamberpot duty, or officium urinae if you're feeling fancy, though no one ever does. The moment you slide into the world, gasping for air through a mouthful of hay dust, a fly lands on your eyelid, and your first view of the world is the cracked underside of a chamber pot that someone set on the shelf above you. It's still dripping. This will be the background to your childhood. Clay pots, the slosh of human waste, and the low, endless hum of people eating, excreting, and demanding more wine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The day of your birth isn't recorded anywhere, not in a census scroll, nor etched on a wax tablet, because babies like you don't get official recognition for at least a month, assuming they survive. And statistically speaking, you probably won't survive this. At least not in the sense we modern folks might hope for. Full adulthood with your teeth and dignity intact. But against the odds, you do survive. You're slippery, squirmy, and cry with a pitch that irritates even the tavern's cat. And somehow, that's enough. Your mother, bone-tired and still bleeding, wraps you in a wine-stained tunic that belonged to your older brother who died during a fever last spring, and she tucks you into a wicker basket that once held radishes. You sleep there, surrounded by the smell of fermented cabbage and goat cheese, while your father wipes his hands on his apron and gets back to work scrubbing the clay pots used earlier by a visiting group of particularly flatulent Iberian sailors. The tavern where you're born is not so much a building as it is a pile of overlapping smells and shouting voices. It squats on a corner, its wooden beams sticky with years of smoke and spilled oil, and its customers range from half-retired soldiers with dice problems to scribes who drink away their lunch breaks. Out back, where you and your family live, if you can call it living in the conventional sense, is a narrow space shared with rats, discarded bones, and the occasional runaway slave hiding under a pile of laundry. Here, chamberpots aren't just your family's trade. They're your furniture. One acts as your mother's stool. Another, chipped and sun-bleached, is the nightstand where your father keeps his collection of bone dice. You don't crawl so much as scoot at first, across tightly packed straw that's been flattened by foot traffic and never once fully dry. And as you grow into a toddler, you learn to walk by steadying yourself on pot handles and overturned pails. Your hands are always damp, always dusty, and you smell faintly of vinegar long before you know what vinegar is. The tavern's matron, an old Gallic woman with more rings than teeth, occasionally slips you bits of roasted beet or crusty bread if you don't cry too much. And this becomes your first understanding of commerce. Silence in exchange for stale food. One of the very first sensations that imprints on your young mind is the sound of sloshing. Not rain, not lullabies, but sloshing, thick, reluctant, gut-churning liquid, moving from side to side as your father lugs his bucket down the alley, mumbling curses under his breath. He's a wiry man, quick with his elbows, and never too far from a wineskin. And he handles the chamber pots with a kind of reverence. Not because he loves his work, but because he's learned that if you don't treat human waste with respect, it will get its revenge. He has scars on his forearms from clay shards, and his left thumb never healed right after a particularly slippery accident involving a senator's guest and some rancid garum. You notice things young that most children don't, like the difference in smell between a merchant's morning chamber pot and that of a legionnaire on shore leave. You recognize the signs of stomach illness long before the patient does, and you develop an instinct for whether a pot was used by a child, a drunk, or someone trying very hard to be discreet. There is, strangely, a kind of science to it, even art, though no one would ever say that out loud. Your parents do not tell bedtime stories about heroes and gods. They tell cautionary tales about broken handles, improperly cured clay, and what happened to cousin Flavius when he ignored a cracked rim and ended up in the Tiber. Your mother is a practical woman. She doesn't coo or sing, but she does let you nap curled up on the folded laundry that hasn't yet been hung. Her back is permanently stooped, her feet calloused from years of barefoot work, and she can balance 2 full pots on her shoulders while holding a scrub brush in her teeth. She teaches you your first words using Chamberpot terms: brim, bottom, lid, and your second set of words are curses, because frankly, those are used even more often. As you begin to speak in halting Latin, mixing it with the gutter dialect of your neighbors, you also begin to observe your world more closely. You notice that people treat your family with a polite sort of invisibility, like they're aware of your presence but would rather not acknowledge it unless absolutely necessary. You aren't quite shunned, but you aren't invited anywhere either. The butcher's son once gave you a plum, but only because he dropped it in the mud and didn't want to eat it himself. Still, there are joys, tiny ones. You love the chickens who wander into your sleeping corner. You like the click-clack of sandals on cobblestone. You laugh when cats fight over scraps, and you chase beetles under the table when your parents are too busy to scold you. And sometimes, when the moon is high and the tavern quiets down for a few rare minutes, you and your mother look up at the stars, and she tells you that even someone like you, born in a place of filth and stink, might live long enough to own your own pot, your own corner, maybe even a place with a roof that doesn't leak. You don't know if that's a wish or a lie, but it feels nice either way, and so you grow. The smells that form your earliest memories are not the sweet, comforting aromas that poets wax lyrical about or noble children might recall. No fig blossoms, no myrrh-scented oil, no fragrant loaves emerging from terracotta ovens, but rather a pungent tapestry of body odor, spoiled wine, acrid vinegar, and the uniquely sour, throat-tightening stench of human waste left too long in the sun. These are the smells that cradle you, rock you to sleep, wake you up at dawn, and serve as the ever-present background to every single moment of your young life. Your mother carries these scents in her hair, in the folds of her tunic, and in the calluses on her hands. And when she wraps her arms around you at night, humming softly, not to soothe you, but to distract herself from aching joints and the itch of flea bites. You breathe her in and feel, despite everything, safe. The air behind the tavern has its own microclimate, a kind of humid consistency that clings to skin and makes everything, clothes, hair, even bread, slightly damp. The back alley is a corridor of forgotten things. Broken crates, splintered stools, dull knives, scraps of linen too torn to reuse, and a single overgrown fig tree that leans like it's listening. Chamberpots, cleaned and drying in the corner, line the wall like sentinels, their wide open mouths tilted toward the morning light, which filters through the slats in the wooden awning in thin golden lines that dust never seems to settle in. On warm days, the smell intensifies, and your nose, even as a child, develops a kind of resilience, not immunity exactly, but a tolerance, the way sailors grow accustomed to salt and mothers to crying. Eventually, you stop noticing the odor entirely, unless it changes, unless something is wrong. Your family, modest as it is, considers cleanliness a point of pride. Not in the decorative sense, like the patricians with their perfumed marble baths and colored mosaics, but in the functional, daily, essential sense. A clean pot means a returning client. A clean child means a mother who still has strength left at the end of the day. And while you're rarely bathed in warm water, your mother wipes you down every night with a rag dipped in vinegar and rainwater collected in a chipped amphora outside the back step. She scrubs your ears until they're pink, cleans beneath your fingernails with the tip of a bone pin, and combs your hair with her fingers while muttering about lice and lazy gods who never once answered her prayers. Though her hands are always cracked and her back curved from years of lifting and crouching, she sings sometimes when she works, in the old tongue of her grandmother. Gaulish phrases that no one in the alley understands, but that make the dogs tilt their heads and the tavern boys go quiet for a moment. These songs, carried on a voice low and raspy from wine fumes and cold nights, are your lullabies, and you begin to associate their rhythm with the sound of water splashing into clay, the scrape of a brush across the inside of a pot, and the slap of wet linen against the stone courtyard. At around the age of 3 or 4, though your family doesn't keep count in years, just in winters survived, you start trailing behind your parents during their rounds, clutching the hem of your father's tunic as he carries 2 full pots on his shoulders, groaning with effort, but never slowing his stride. You walk the alleys of Rome, stepping over sleeping drunks and ducking under hanging laundry, memorizing every twist and turn of the city before you learn your letters. You learn to identify doorways not by number or name, but by the kind of waste they produce. The weaver's home smells of dye and wool. The fishmonger's has a sharp, metallic edge that makes your nose burn. and the wealthy family at the end of the street, who never speak to you directly, but always leave their pot just outside the gate. Smells of rose petals, liver, and deep, rich sauces your family has never tasted. The city is a living thing, and you begin to notice its rhythms the way a farmer might track weather or a soldier memorizes the beat of a march. Morning is for fresh waste, lunchtime for the second round of pot pickups, and evening, always, is the time of final cleansing. You don't understand what most of these people do all day. Why one man always yells at scrolls and another sleeps by the bakery. But you learn to avoid the places where dogs grow too bold, or where rooftops leak in ways that soak the back of your neck as you pass. You also begin to understand danger. Not danger in the dramatic, gladiatorial sense, but the quiet, creeping kind. The kind that comes when someone slips on a wet stone with a full pot, or when a child picks up a broken shard thinking it's a toy. Once, you watch as your father gently but firmly shoves a man twice his size for letting his chamber pot overflow. Respect the pot. Respect the cleaner, he mutters afterward, spitting on the ground and shaking his head. That phrase lodges in your young mind, becomes a kind of mantra that you repeat when you carry water, when you brush dried filth from a bowl, when your hands ache and your knees are raw. It's not noble, it's not glorious, but it's what you do. Your first toy, if one could even call it that, is a broken amphora handle, curved just enough to fit comfortably in your palm. You pretend it's a spoon, a sword, sometimes even a boat, depending on your mood. The older boys mock you, but you don't care. It's yours. You name it something grand. Rutilius, perhaps, after a name you overheard in a tavern tale, and carry it everywhere, even to sleep. A piece of ceramic, smooth from your fingers and the oils of your skin, becomes a constant companion until it finally cracks in half one summer evening when you trip chasing a pigeon near the latrine barrels. You cry, of course, but only until your mother gives you a new treasure, a rounded stone that glitters faintly when wet and fits perfectly between your thumb and forefinger. You begin to collect such things: bones shaped like dogs, shells from the river, feathers, buttons. A coin so worn it no longer shows the emperor's face. These become your hidden hoard, tucked beneath a loose floor tile behind the pots. And checking on them becomes your private ritual, a moment of silent joy in a world that offers little of it freely. By the time you're old enough to help with the actual scrubbing, your hands are already hardened. You don't flinch at the smell, don't gag at the sight. You just dip your brush, breathe through your mouth, and work in circles the way your father taught you. And when you finish your first full pot by yourself, a large one, used by a family of 6 during a festival, you feel something close to pride. Your father slaps your shoulder, grunts approvingly, and says, "You've got the hands for it," which, in your world, is high praise. People don't thank you, not really. Sometimes they nod. Sometimes they leave an extra coin. But mostly they ignore you. And so you learn to observe rather than engage. You notice how the lady with the red sandals always walks with her head high. How the old man with the crooked cane hides wine in his cloak. How children playing in the alley will pause when you pass, holding their breath, waiting for the smell to follow you like a curse. It does. And still, you walk. Because this is your job. This is your life. And every day you survive, Every pot you clean, every shard you avoid stepping on, every scrap of bread you earn, it all builds into something strange and silent and solid, a kind of purpose. Your childhood is not filled with the kind of toys that future poets and wealthy scribes will reminisce about. There are no wax dolls in tiny tunics, no miniature chariots carved from olive wood, and certainly no silver rattles or story scrolls illustrated in color. But instead, your world is built from what's discarded, forgotten, or broken. And your imagination, ever desperate to make sense of things, transforms these cast-offs into objects of great and secret importance. The broken amphora handle, which you named and cherished for months before its inevitable cracking, was merely the first of many such treasures. And as you grow a little older, still barefoot, still dusty, still small enough to hide under the tavern benches without anyone noticing, you begin to collect the bits and pieces of the city that others overlook, stashing them away in a little alcove behind a stack of spare pots near the laundry vats. You find a bent bronze spoon with the handle shaped like a dolphin, worn smooth from decades of use and possibly teeth marks, and decide it must once have belonged to a palace servant or maybe even a senator's cook. A shard of black glass, sharp at first, but now dulled by weeks of river rubbing, becomes your blade, which you brandish dramatically when playing pretend alone in the alley while your parents scrub and haul. A chicken bone, surprisingly symmetrical and light as a feather, transforms into a stylus in your games. And though you can't write yet and have never touched real ink, you use it to trace squiggles in the dust while humming songs you only half remember from your mother's evening mumblings. Your collection grows, and with it, your mind stretches to accommodate a world richer than the one you walk through each day. A world where even the cracked handle of a bucket might hold magical power, where the crooked twig wedged behind the stable might secretly be a scepter. And yet, the real world has a way of creeping in, always, like sour steam through a floorboard. You begin to understand that some things are yours and some are not. And this understanding is often reinforced by the sharp smacks of your mother's sandal or the muttered curses of your father when he catches you using a scrubbing brush as a helmet. Still, they don't stop you from playing entirely, perhaps because they know that even among the rot and refuse, even among the flies and the mildew, even among the chamber pots and vinegar, a child must still have a sliver of joy to hold on to, or else what's the point? Sometimes, when the tavern is quiet and no customers have come to shout for wine or stew, your mother lets you play inside the empty storeroom, where you imagine yourself the keeper of Roman secrets. You build towers from folded rags and prop bits of broken pottery around them like sentries. You draw crude diagrams in spilled flour, diagrams that look nothing like anything, but which you insist are maps. You talk to the mice who dart along the rafters, naming them after gods you've never properly heard stories of. And once, just once, you imagine that you're not the child of a chamberpot washer at all, but a merchant's son. One who has sandals that match and who gets bathed every morning in milk and saffron. The fantasy doesn't last long, not because you tire of it, but because your mother calls for you to fetch more vinegar, and the illusion crumbles with the first footstep into the wet earth outside. The first time you see a real toy is at the public fountain near the forum. A wealthy child, maybe 6 or 7, no older than you, is holding a painted wooden horse, its body bright with red lacquer and its mane made from tiny tufts of wool dyed blue. The child is laughing, his hair combed and shiny, his sandals new, his tunic crisp and clean. You stare, not out of jealousy exactly, but something adjacent to it, something you don't yet have the words for, something heavy and hollow that settles in your chest like a wet rag. You reach toward it, just a little, maybe unconsciously, maybe out of instinct, and the child's nursemaid slaps your hand away and glares at you as though you are some pest that's crawled out of a crack in the paving stones. You don't cry. You never cry in public, not anymore. Instead, you go back to your alley and spend that afternoon carving tiny legs onto a stick with a piece of tile. The stick doesn't look like a horse. It doesn't stand up. It doesn't shine. But it's yours, and that seems enough. You name it Bellator, the warrior, and whisper stories to it at night before bed. Long tales of battle and glory where the chamber pots are always clean, the vinegar always fresh, and the tavern always quiet. The older you grow, the more you come to understand the value of quiet, not silence. Rome is never truly silent, not even deep in the night, but the sort of quiet that lives in narrow gaps between moments. The breath between a wine spill and your father's shout, the lull between a tavern brawl and the sound of a chair breaking, the hush when your mother pauses her scrubbing to flex her fingers and gaze into nothing. You learn to listen to these silences, to live in them, to shape your games and daydreams around their edges. Your understanding of tools, too, begins to sharpen. Where once you swung ladles like swords and built towers from dirty linens, you now start to recognize the real use of these objects. The ladle is for scooping, not just for liquids, but for clumped waste hardened in the bottom of pots. The linen is not for castles, but for straining bathhouse sludge from the runoff bucket. The brush is not a toy. It is your inheritance, your responsibility, your burden, and slowly, almost without realizing, you begin to reach for these things with less curiosity and more intention. You are not yet old enough to carry the heavy pots yourself, not without spilling, and spills are costly in more ways than one, but you can clean them. Your mother shows you how to do it properly, not the way you mimicked as a toddler, but with real purpose. She teaches you to grip the rim just so, how to brace the pot against your thigh, how to scrub in tight circles with ash paste until the residue loosens, how to rinse without splashing your face. She explains the importance of the final sniff. Not a deep inhale, of course, just a quick whiff to ensure no sourness remains. If it still smells like something died, she says, you haven't finished yet. And you, eager to please, eager to grow, eager to be useful, nod solemnly and repeat the lesson to yourself over and over until it becomes muscle memory. There's pride in doing something well, even something so humble, so easily dismissed by those above you. You begin to take note of which pots are hardest to clean, thicker ones, often used by those who eat rich diets, and which clients leave coins or scraps of food as thanks. You even start experimenting, testing whether a rinse of wine dregs works better than vinegar on certain stains. It doesn't, but you enjoy the smell. And whether dried sage wrapped in linen helps absorb odor faster. It does, marginally. Your parents notice your efforts, but say little. Though once, your father tosses you a plum and calls you a clever little pot rat, which is as close to affection as he ever gets when sober. The days are long, but they pass quickly when filled with work and quiet wonder. You begin to anticipate your tasks. You organize your corner of the courtyard, arranging brushes by stiffness, storing stones used for scraping in order of size. You develop preferences. Bronze pots are your favorite. They hold heat better and scrub cleaner. Clay ones are prone to cracking. You dread the ones with decorative ridges, as waste tends to cling stubbornly in the grooves. And all the while, your private world, the one of stones and feathers and imaginary horses, continues in parallel, quieter now, but never entirely gone. You still add to your hidden hoard, still whisper to your creations at night, still see the city in a way that others don't, through a lens shaped by sweat and steam and silent observation. You are a child of Rome, not its future general or senator or orator, but its quiet, dirty, indispensable underlayer. And you are learning. There comes a point in every child's life, regardless of whether they're born into marble villas or into alleyways behind wine-soaked taverns, when the hazy blur of passive observation gives way to the sharper, more deliberate awareness that this, whatever this may be, is the world they have inherited. Not because they asked for it, and certainly not because they deserve or earned it, but simply because the world has a way of continuing whether you consent or not. And in your case, the inheritance is one of clay pots filled with other people's business, of early mornings that smell of ash and vinegar, and of a father whose face is most often turned downward toward the ground as he watches for cracks in the path or slippery spots where a drop too much of slop might send him, and the pot he carries sprawling in disgrace. Your father is not a sentimental man. He doesn't tell stories of his youth, doesn't cradle your head in moments of tenderness, and certainly doesn't speak of dreams or ambitions as though they were things worth chasing. He is, in fact, rather like the pots he carries. Strong, useful, chipped in a few places, and always either too full or nearly empty. He wakes before the sun and begins his work with the resigned grunt of someone who knows that no matter how early he starts, the city will always have more to offer him than he can ever carry, and most of it will be heavy and unpleasant. But for all his grumbling, for all his curses muttered under his breath, he works. That, in your household, is the most sacred virtue. Not faith, not honor, not even cleverness, but work. If your hands are moving, your feet shuffling, your back aching, then you are doing the right thing. And one day, not long after your 8th winter, he hands you a pot that is not quite empty but no longer full, and I says simply, "Time you learned the proper way to dump it." You hold it awkwardly, the rim still warm from the hand that last used it, the base slightly slick, and your arms tremble under the unfamiliar weight. It smells. Of course it smells. But you don't gag like you used to, not anymore. Instead, you follow your father down the narrow lane, past a sleeping dog curled under a cart, past the bakery where the day's first loaves are already cooling on a stone shelf, and toward the disposal trench at the end of the alley. A long, shallow ditch that collects refuse from 3 surrounding streets before it gets shoveled toward the sewer grate at the corner. You reach the edge, hold your breath, and tip the pot with both hands, watching its contents slop into the muck below with a sound that's half splash, half sigh. Your father nods once, says again, and you realize with a strange, sinking clarity that you've passed another invisible threshold, one that cannot be undone, one that marks you quietly but permanently as someone who now participates in the family trade, not just in play, but in purpose. From that moment forward, your role changes. No longer merely the child underfoot, the one who hums while sweeping or fetches rags and vinegar. You are now an apprentice in earnest. You're expected to clean, to dump, to carry smaller pots on your own, and eventually, to do full pickups when your father is nursing a bruised ankle or your mother is hunched over with fever. The pots you carry belong to the neighborhood's poorer tenants, those who can't afford the nicer clay or the elaborate bronze designs that wealthier clients prefer. These simpler vessels are lighter, less fragile, and easier to manage, and they become your early training ground, the proving ground for a skill that, while never celebrated, is essential to the functioning of the entire Roman machine. Because here's the thing no one likes to say out loud, but everyone knows deep down. Without people like your family, Rome would quite literally drown in its own excess. Behind every banquet, every public bath, every temple offering or grain dole, there is someone sweeping, collecting, cleaning, dumping, and scrubbing. And while your family doesn't wear uniforms or carry symbols of office, you are part of a hidden order, a necessary layer that keeps the layers above from collapsing under their own weight. It's not glorious, but it is important. That thought keeps you going on the harder days. Your father begins to teach you the finer points of the trade, not just the physical techniques, but the subtler rules of etiquette and strategy. Don't walk too fast past a patrician's door, he says. They don't like the noise. Always wipe the rim before handing it back, even if it's clean, because people notice the gesture more than the smell. If a pot's been sitting out too long, rinse the outside before touching the handle. Rats like to pee on them. You commit these lessons to memory, not because you're afraid of mistakes, but because you've learned that small errors in this line of work can lead to large consequences. Fines, insults, or worse. One day, while hauling a half-filled bronze pot from a brothel down the street, you stumble slightly, your sandal catching on a loose cobblestone, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the pot tilts dangerously. You catch it, just barely, but the motion causes a small slosh of liquid to spill over the edge and dribble down your leg. It's warm, it's sticky, and it's humiliating, especially when one of the brothel's dancers, perched lazily on a windowsill above, laughs and calls down, "Careful, little piss boy, the gods frown on wastefulness." You say nothing. You've learned that silence is often the best shield, that dignity can be preserved not through defiance, but through enduring. And later that evening, when your mother helps you scrub your legs with vinegar and salt, you pretend not to notice the way her hands linger a little longer on your knees. Not to comfort you, but because she knows what that moment meant. Despite the daily grime, you begin to notice patterns in the job that others miss. You learn, for instance, that people's diets are seasonal, richer and spicier in the autumn, more fish-heavy in the spring, and that this affects the texture and smell of the waste. It becomes a kind of crude weather forecast for you. Too much fig and cheese this week, your father grumbles after a long day of particularly noxious pots, and you nod knowingly, already planning to bring an extra pouch of mint leaves to stuff into your tunic collar for the next round. You also notice that the chamber pots themselves vary wildly in design and quality. Some are basic clay with rough edges, Others are polished bronze with ornate handles, engraved with lions, dolphins, or busts of minor gods. One client, a retired centurion with an inflated sense of grandeur, has a pot shaped like a war helmet, complete with a plume etched into the lid. Makes him feel heroic, your father says, rolling his eyes. And while most people look away as you pass, there are a few who smile, who nod, who sometimes even offer a word of thanks. An old washerwoman gives you an apple once. A blind lute player tells you that he appreciates the way you don't splash near his mat. A baker leaves a burnt loaf on the steps for you on days when the bread didn't rise properly. These small gestures begin to accumulate in your mind. Tiny signs that while your work may be invisible to most, it isn't entirely unappreciated. But the work is not without its hazards. The pots are heavy, the paths are slick, and your body begins to show the signs of strain far earlier than it should. Your shoulders ache at night. Your knees pop when you crouch, and your palms are calloused beyond your years. Still, you persist because you must, and because the rhythm of the job, while unglamorous, is predictable, and predictability in your world is a kind of safety. And somewhere, deep in the quiet corners of your mind, that child who once imagined his bone stylus as a royal scepter still lingers. He doesn't speak as often now, drowned out by the slosh of pots and the bark of tired muscles, but he hasn't disappeared entirely. At night, after the pots are scrubbed, after the vinegar is stored, after your parents have sunk into exhausted silence, you sometimes pick up a smooth pebble or a curled leaf and tuck it away, a silent nod to the part of you that still believes in small magic, even if the world smells like waste. Your hands begin to learn balance long before the rest of your body catches up. Long before your arms are strong enough to carry 2 full chamber pots at once. And far before your back understands how to distribute the weight across your hips instead of absorbing it all in your spine like the world's most unfortunate pack mule. You watch your father, still wiry, still quiet, still muttering Latin prayers no gods ever seem to hear, as he moves with the precision of someone who's broken too many pots in the past to risk another. His legs spaced slightly apart, his steps short and deliberate, his arms bent just enough to absorb the sway of the liquid inside, but never so tight that he'll tip it. The pots themselves are never perfectly full, because no one wants to walk across the forum with sloshing waist brushing against their knees. But they're always just full enough to be risky, to remind you with every step that you are not, and may never be, truly in control. Carrying a chamber pot in Rome is not like carrying any other object. A loaf of bread can be dropped and brushed off. A jug of water can be spilled and refilled. But a chamber pot, especially a full one, especially a large one, especially one belonging to a senator's villa or a brothel's upper rooms, is a volatile thing. A test of your rhythm, your focus, and your humility. The handle might be chipped, the base slick with condensation, the lid poorly fitted or missing entirely. Every step must be deliberate, every turn calculated, and every breath timed to avoid the worst of the odor rising up in humid puffs. You begin to walk differently, almost like a dancer, not with grace or elegance, but with a kind of slow, practical choreography. Heel first, slight lean forward, tighten the elbows, shift the weight when descending a step. Your first solo delivery comes during a dry afternoon when your father has been summoned to assist with a larger municipal disposal job near the Tiber, and your mother is laid up with a bruised rib after slipping in the washroom the previous evening. The pot is a small one, mercifully, belonging to an old widow who lives 2 doors down and usually does her business only once a day. Still, it's heavy, and the handle is rough on your fingers, and the courtyard stones are uneven, cracked from heat and age and the relentless traffic of sandals and hooves. You hold it tightly, arms aching, back stiff, and every time it sloshes, your heart pounds just a little harder. By the time you reach the trench, your tunic is damp with sweat, and you're gritting your teeth. But you do it. You tip it out, rinse it twice, wipe the inside with a vinegar cloth just like your mother taught you, and carry it back with pride swelling in your chest, like you've just returned from a campaign in Gaul, and no one cheers. The widow says nothing. Your father doesn't even glance at you when he returns that evening, too tired from hauling to care. Your mother, half asleep from the herbal paste she smeared over her ribs, murmurs, "Good," and drifts off before she can finish the sentence. But still, in that moment, standing there in the corner of the courtyard, with the empty pot resting beside your foot, you feel something change, some shift in your spine, not physical, but emotional. You are no longer the helper, the observer, the small one who fetches tools and stirs soap. You are now a practitioner, a carrier, someone trusted with the full, messy weight of the job. And from then on, the deliveries become more frequent. Not all of them are easy. Some are uphill, to houses with winding steps and cramped doorways that require turning sideways and breathing in just to pass. Others are far too full, and you suspect their owners are saving on fees by filling a single pot to capacity rather than paying for 2 collections. Some pots are warm when you lift them. Some are sticky. Some are crusted on the rim with the residue of meals you never get to eat. One in particular, from a butcher's assistant with poor aim and worse hygiene, requires you to hold your breath for nearly the entire return trip. You count steps. You hum tunes in your head. You fantasize about being anywhere else, anyone else. A poet, a baker, even a soldier. Until you realize that most soldiers just end up with more visible scars and a different kind of filth to carry. You get better at it. Your hands toughen. Your grip improves. You learn how to tilt the pot slightly to counteract its sway, and how to shift your footing when stepping onto slick stone. You figure out which sandals give the best traction, and how to pad the inside of your tunic sleeves with spare cloth so that the pot rims don't dig into your forearms. You experiment with carrying 2 small pots at once, one in each hand, and while your mother clicks her tongue and warns you not to rush your growth, your father gives a quiet grunt that you interpret, generously, as approval. Carrying pots becomes your rhythm. You wake before sunrise, eat a few olives or half a crust of bread, stretch your back against the side wall where the sun first hits, and begin the route. Down the alley, through the courtyard, up the rear stairs of the tenement, out past the bathhouse, always looping in the same pattern, always watching the streets for signs of danger. A spilled oil jug, a cart left askew, a drunk staggering too close for comfort. You begin to recognize faces, some kind, some indifferent, some mocking. A few children wave, most don't. One merchant's apprentice throws stones at you once, shouting something about pot breath. But your mother teaches you how to return a curse silently, with a look that promises they'll meet you again one day when they're the ones holding the pot. You also begin to notice the sounds. The slosh of the waste inside is one sound, the most obvious. But there's also the clink of the lid, when there is one. The scrape of the pot base against your leg. The hollow thunk when you set it down just a little too hard. You start to distinguish types of waste by ear alone. The watery swish of illness, the thick plop of a heavy meal, the faint fizz of fermentation. You don't talk about these things, of course, not even with your family, but they settle in your mind like strange little facts you carry with you, as if one day you might be tested on them. And as strange as it may sound, you begin to take pride in your stability. Others around you, boys your age who help with laundry or cart deliveries, still spill things, still drop jars, still trip over loose stones. But not you, not anymore. You walk like a shadow now, like a part of the street itself. The pots don't slosh quite as much when you carry them, and even your father, gruff and unreadable as he is, begins handing you the heavier ones without hesitation. There is an odd sort of honor in this, the kind of honor no one talks about because it's soaked in piss and ignored by everyone who benefits from it. But you feel it. You own it. You are becoming a Chamberpot washer, not just by birth, but by bone, by muscle, by movement. And still, you dream, quietly, during your breaks, while sitting with your back against the wall and chewing on a fig stem. You dream of maybe one day having your own clients, your own route, maybe even a helper of your own. You imagine being called master cleaner in jest, but with just a touch of respect. You picture someone, anyone, saying, "He's the best in the alley, never spills, never cracks a pot." You don't dream of riches. You don't dream of escape. You dream of competence, of mastery, of being so good at something, however filthy, that no one can deny it. And that, in your little corner of the empire, is what passes for ambition. You begin to notice, slowly and almost reluctantly, that what Romans eat becomes not just a passing curiosity to you, or even an unfortunate part of the job, but a critical piece of information, an involuntary intimacy you share with every household whose pot you carry, an insight into their habits, their status, their health, and sometimes even their secrets, all decoded not through conversation or gossip, but through the half-digested remains that greet you at the bottom of each clay or bronze container. Most people don't think about what they flush away, or rather, in your time, what they set out in a pot by the doorway, hoping someone else will handle it. But you do, because your work depends on it. Because the difficulty of your day often hinges on whether the merchant 3 doors down had chickpea stew or rich duck meat the night before. And because your hands and your nose have become unwilling connoisseurs of digestion in all its unpredictable glory. You come to know, for example, that a man who eats salted fish 5 days in a row will produce a smell so sharp and sour it can make your eyes water before the lid is even off. While a family that lives mostly on barley porridge and turnips produces waste that is far more tolerable, if rather mushy and alarmingly beige. You develop preferences, not in the usual way, where a person might say, "I prefer plums to grapes," but in the grim calculus of waste. You prefer the waste of the olive vendor's household to that of the spice merchant's, not because it smells better, but because it's less likely to contain unexpected lumps. And you prefer figs in summer not for their sweetness, but because they pass through people quickly and cleanly, leaving behind little residue. Every pot is a kind of letter, a report, a window into someone's private life. And though no one talks about it, you know that chamberpot washers like yourself possess a kind of omniscience that no priest or politician could ever hope to match. You know who is ill before the family sends for a physician, because illness always reveals itself in smell and texture. You know which children are being fed properly and which are not, which wives sneak honeyed cakes in the middle of the night, and which old men are nearing the end because their pots come back lighter and lighter each week. Once, you even deduce that a young wife is pregnant. Not because she tells anyone, not because it shows yet in her figure, but because her pot tells you in its peculiar combination of sourness, inconsistency, and the unmistakable presence of half-chewed grape skins. A strange craving you've come to associate with the earliest months of Roman womanhood, and no one ever thanks you for knowing these things, nor do they even acknowledge that you could know them, because your job, by its very nature, depends on invisibility, on quiet discretion, on the societal agreement that those who carry away waste do not speak of what they find. But still, you know. You know more than most about what it means to be alive in this empire. What it looks like, smells like, feels like when a body consumes and releases, thrives and sickens, lives and dies. And in a strange, unspeakable way, that knowledge gives you a feeling not quite like power, but perhaps like place, like rootedness, like being part of a system too vast to see and too foul for most to admit, but real nonetheless, and indispensable. As you continue your rounds, as you move from house to house with your shoulders hunched slightly forward and your fingers wrapped tight around the handles of glazed ceramic, you start to form mental catalogs of households, not by name or occupation, but by diet, by digestive quirk, by olfactory profile. The family near the temple eats a diet heavy in dates and cheese, which produces waste that clings to the pot like wet parchment. The retired centurion down the alley drinks too much mulled wine, and his pot is often half liquid and bright red from beet stew, or more concerningly, blood. The baker's apprentice eats on the go, and his pot contains bits of burnt crust and the occasional pebble, chewed accidentally in haste. These are the details you store, not because you want to, but because you must. Because the efficiency of your work depends on it. Because knowing what you're about to carry lets you prepare, mentally, physically, sometimes even emotionally. There's also a certain quiet humor in it, if you let yourself look at it that way. Not humor in the way that makes people laugh out loud, but the dark, dry kind of humor that keeps you sane when you're ankle deep in what others flush away. You chuckle to yourself when you notice that the same senator who delivers speeches about restraint and temperance has pots that reek of oyster and lamb feasts. You shake your head with weary amusement when the philosopher who lectures young men on bodily purity sets out a pot that could fell a mule. There is irony everywhere if you squint, if you tilt your head just so. And though you can't share it with anyone, not really, you carry it inside you like a private joke, a defense against the smell, the weight, the endless repetition. Once you get bold. You're cleaning a particularly large bronze pot left outside a villa that prides itself on luxury and refinement. And you notice, half buried in the filth. A tiny gold earring, no bigger than your fingernail, delicate and filigreed. You stare at it for a long time, unsure whether to touch it, unsure whether it was lost accidentally or discarded purposefully. You clean around it, carefully, like a surgeon, until it gleams enough to recognize the shape. A dolphin curled in a leaping arc. You could pocket it, you could sell it, but instead, you place it on a nearby stone ledge, visible but not obvious, and continue cleaning. The next day, it's gone. You don't know whether it was retrieved by its owner or stolen by someone else, but the act of leaving it there, of choosing not to steal, not to keep, makes you feel oddly noble, which is not a feeling you often associate with your profession. Your father, when you tell him about it, just grunts. "That's one less thing to get whipped for," he says, and though his tone is flat, you catch the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, he's proud. Of course, not all discoveries are amusing or valuable. Once, while cleaning a pot from a tenement near the Tanner's Alley, you find a small finger bone, clean and pale and unmistakably human. You freeze, your stomach turning in slow circles, and for a moment you think about running, about telling someone, about doing something. But your father sees it too, and without a word, he takes the pot, dumps it fully, and buries the bone in the corner trench. "Nothing to be done," he says, "and no good comes from knowing more than you need to." You nod, slowly, and never ask about it again. There's something about this line of work that teaches you to see things others miss, but also to unsee them just as quickly. You learn when to speak and when to stay silent, when to ask questions and when to pretend you didn't hear the noise from behind the curtain. You become a sort of moving shadow in people's lives, present but unnoticed, essential but unwanted. And in that strange, quiet liminality, you begin to understand your place in the world more deeply than you ever did as a child, playing with bone toys in the dirt. And though no one ever says it, least of all your parents, you begin to realize that being a Chamberpot washer requires more than strength, more than balance, more than tolerance for stench. It requires a kind of subtle intelligence, a capacity to hold contradictions in your mind, that you can be filthy and honorable, invisible and essential, mocked and respected, all at the same time. And so, each morning, you wake before the sun, stretch your sore back, rinse your hands in cold water, and begin your work again. Because Rome eats, and what it eats, eventually, becomes your responsibility. You don't remember the first time you were entrusted with the family's cleaning kit. It just sort of happened one day, slipped into your hands like a torch passed in the quiet of dusk, not ceremoniously, not with words or nods of approval, but with the matter-of-factness of routine, as if everyone had simply agreed, without saying so, that your fingers were now ready to grip the same tools your parents had gripped for years. The kit itself isn't grand, of course. Nothing like a carpenter's chest or a physician's satchel. But it is nonetheless a sacred bundle in your family, rolled tightly into a linen cloth that smells of soap ash, garlic, and vinegar, containing all the alchemical essentials for transforming filth into something at least less offensive, if not actually clean by higher standards. There is the long-handled wooden brush carved from olive root, its bristles worn but still stiff, blackened at the base from years of use and stained with the faint memory of countless pots. There is the small tin container of sand, fine, beige, and ever so slightly gritty, which your father insists must be mixed only with warm water, never cold, or it won't lather properly. There's a pouch of crushed onion skin, an old trick from your mother's side of the family, said to awaken the pot with its acidic bite. And then, most importantly, the small glass bottle of olive oil infused with rosemary and mint, which your mother swears by for final rinses, because she claims, perhaps foolishly, perhaps brilliantly, that clients are less angry when their pots smell like a garden instead of a battlefield. You begin to take this kit seriously, guarding it not just from thieves or children playing in the alley, but from damp, heat, and rats, and you start to develop your own small additions. A bent spoon you use for scraping stubborn residue, a fragment of pumice for pots that come in with baked-on crusts, a bit of frayed linen for gentle wiping, and eventually, a piece of broken glass, smoothed over time and dull at the edges, which you find works miracles on those tight ceramic corners that the brush never quite reaches. You clean your tools as religiously as you clean the pots, because in your world, tools are not things to be used and tossed away, but companions, extensions of your hands, of your intentions, of your dignity. Your mother shows you how to blend vinegar and ash into a paste so thick it spreads like wax and clings to the inside of the pots, seeping into the pores of the clay where smells like to settle. You learn to judge the ratio by smell alone. Too much ash and it's gritty, useless. Too much vinegar and it runs, fails to hold. She teaches you the proper timing too. Let it sit for just the right number of breaths. Long enough to cut through residue, but short enough that it doesn't dry and turn to cement. These aren't lessons you can find in scrolls or learn in lectures at the forum. They're passed hand to hand, whispered between brush strokes and rinses, and held in the kind of memory that doesn't fade with age, only becomes more automatic. You also learn that heat is both a friend and a foe. On sunny days, the pots dry quickly, which means less scrubbing, but also means the filth hardens into a shell if left unattended. On cold days, the smell is weaker, but the clay stays wet longer. Your hands numb as you scrub and rinse and wipe. And the oil you use to finish each pot sometimes congeals into a waxy film that must be rubbed in circles until it disappears. You begin to time your work according to weather, adjusting your routine with the instincts of a farmer watching the sky. You learn which alleyways get more sun, which corners stay cool and damp, and where to store pots for optimal drying. And when it rains, truly rains, you huddle in the covered corner of the courtyard with your kit tucked inside your tunic, waiting for the thunder to pass, occasionally catching drips in the hollow of a turned-over lid, thinking of nothing in particular except how wet everything smells when the air itself seems to be sweating. At first, you work beside your parents, learning by imitation, copying their posture, their grip, the way they huff through their noses when the brush slips or a splatter hits the wrong spot. But soon, your tasks diverge. Your father begins sending you off with your own list of pots to collect and clean, trusting you to choose the right scrub, the right oil, the right number of rinses. He watches from a distance, nodding occasionally, correcting rarely, and though he still speaks little, always more action than word. You notice the way he lets you pick from the better set of brushes now. the ones with full bristles, the ones your mother used to guard as if they were made of gold. There's a rhythm to it all, a choreography of movement and timing that becomes second nature. You collect the pot with a quiet knock. You cradle it carefully against your side. You walk in measured steps so the contents don't slosh. You set it down gently near the wash basin. You unscrew the lid or lift it depending on the make, and then you breathe, only through your mouth, and begin. The paste goes on first, then the brushing, the first rinse, the second rinse, the final wipe, the oiling, and finally, the breath test. A shallow sniff to confirm that it no longer carries the ghost of what it once held. You polish the rim with a soft cloth, not because anyone notices, but because you do, and because you've started to believe that clean isn't clean unless you'd use it yourself. And though you never would, the standard helps. You start to develop small rituals around your work, tiny routines that calm your mind when the smell becomes overwhelming, or your arms begin to shake from hours of scrubbing. You hum a tune your mother once sang, low and steady. You count the brush strokes, 12 to the left, 12 to the right. Rinse, repeat. You whisper the names of Roman emperors in order of reign, a trick one of the tavern's more educated patrons taught you after too many mugs of watered-down wine. You mutter prayers to Lares and Penates, to obscure deities of household filth and protection, whether they exist or not, simply because the words fill the air and make the task feel lighter. Other washers have their own styles, their own tricks. You hear stories, some true, some exaggerated, of cleaners who use lemon rinds stolen from kitchen scraps, who boil herbs for hours to create secret potions that kill odor, who claim that humming in a certain pitch makes the dirt release more easily. You test some of these yourself. Lemon doesn't work, not really, but it masks the smell for a moment. Mint helps, especially when crushed under your thumbnail and rubbed along the pot's rim. The humming? It helps you, even if the pot doesn't care. You begin to think of yourself not just as a cleaner, but as a kind of caretaker, a guardian of sanitation in a city that celebrates excess and beauty while quietly ignoring the filth that makes such glory possible. You see yourself as someone who brings order to chaos, who transforms the disgusting into the tolerable, and who, though nameless and often overlooked, holds in his hands the power to make another's day slightly less revolting. That may not sound like much to those who've never handled a Chamberpot, but to you, it is a kind of daily triumph. And though no one says it, you start to notice a difference in how people respond. A nod here, a coin there, a slight delay before the usual wrinkle of the nose. The same senator who once waved you off with a sneer now lets you set the pot down inside the door instead of outside. A wealthy widow begins requesting you specifically. A bathhouse attendant offers you a cup of warm water on a cold morning. Small things, but they add up. They remind you that even in a city like Rome, where glory is carved in marble and honor is draped in silk, there is still a place for those who clean in silence and serve with vinegar and sand. You never expected to take pride in oil and ash and the scent of rosemary hiding the remnants of someone else's digestion. But here you are, kit in hand, back straight, brush in motion, breathing through your mouth, and telling yourself that if Rome cannot function without you, then you must be doing something right. You first get loaned to the bathhouse on a chilly morning when the sky is an uncommitted gray, neither threatening rain nor offering any promise of warmth. The kind of day that makes old joints ache and street dogs curl tighter beneath broken carts. And you know something is different. When your father, still chewing the same piece of barley bread from the night before, nods toward you without looking up and mutters, "Thermi wants help today. Go. Don't speak. Don't touch what they don't give you. Do the job." He doesn't explain further, but he doesn't need to. You've passed the bathhouse hundreds of times, watched the thick clouds of steam rise from its roof vents like a bakery for giants, heard the echo of men laughing and arguing from within its marble guts, and seen the attendants, barefoot, red-cheeked, and always half-drenched, moving in and out with buckets and rags and the permanent distracted haste of those too busy to think. The bathhouse itself, though just another building in Rome to most, feels to you like stepping into a different city, one built from condensation and echoes, where the walls sweat constantly and every sound bounces twice before settling, and the air is thick not only with steam, but with perfume and oil and that strange blend of heat and bodies that hits your face the moment you cross the threshold. You're greeted not with words, but with a cloth shoved into your chest by a boy a few years older than you, his hair already dripping, his tunic clinging to his ribs, his arms glistening like meat on a spit. He points to a pile of wooden buckets, then to the far end of the bath complex, where the floors shine with a thin coat of grease, and you understand, without needing to be told, that your task, for now, is scrubbing. You begin with your knees pressed into warm, wet stone, your hands moving in slow circles through water so murky you can't see your own fingernails beneath the surface. The bucket is filled with a concoction that smells like a mixture of pine resin, wine dregs, and something medicinal, perhaps lavender or crushed laurel leaves. And you use a rag that's been through 1,000 washes, but still manages to leave strands of fiber behind, like a tired animal shedding. You scrub the tiles that frame the tepidarium, the warm bath, where older men recline like walruses, their bellies rising and falling in a kind of lazy rhythm, steam curling around their ears like crowns, their voices muffled as if the heat has boiled their thoughts into slow, drawling syllables. No one speaks to you directly, which you find comforting. They glance sometimes, usually without curiosity, sometimes with mild disapproval if your scrubbing makes too much noise, or if you pass too closely to their towel pile. But mostly they ignore you, which is preferable to being noticed. You move from floor to floor, basin to basin, learning quickly which patches of tile are slick with oil and which carry the faint grit of dead skin and bath salts. The walls drip. Your tunic sticks to your back. Your fingers prune and ache. And through it all, the heat persists. Not a comforting warmth, but a smothering one, like being hugged by a wool blanket soaked in sweat. In time, you're asked, wordlessly, with a nod and a gesture, to assist with the drainage buckets, the ones that catch the overflow from the sweating men's bodies, from their rinsed feet and splashed hair, from the oils rubbed on their shoulders by slaves whose expressions are equal parts boredom and calculation. These buckets, unlike chamberpots, don't smell of digestion, but of something stranger: feet, skin, herbs, and mildew. A kind of human soup that settles at the bottom and grows cloudy with time. You carry these carefully, sloshing only slightly, and dump them into a larger basin that connects to the outer gutter system. Though the runoff still coats your sandals and seeps between your toes, leaving a film you won't be able to scrub away until morning. And though you've spent your life around filth, this is a new kind of intimacy with other people's bodies. Not the waste they leave behind, but the parts they polish. The parts they expose to heat and steam and shared conversation. You hear men speak of politics, of gladiator matches, of distant provinces and local rumors. You learn accidentally who's sleeping with whose wife, who bribed a magistrate, who has gout but won't admit it, and who fears being poisoned by their own slaves. The bathhouse is a confessional without priests, a theater without actors, a boiling room of secrets and skins, and you walk among it with a lowered head and sharpened ears. There is one attendant, older than you by perhaps 5 years, who watches you more closely than the others. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't sneer either. He sees how you carry the buckets, how you scrub with the grain of the tile, how you never let your rag drift too close to the heated bronze brazier in the corner. On your 3rd day, he offers you a handful of dates, sticky and warm from his pocket, and says, "You're quiet. That's good." You nod, not sure if it's a compliment or a warning, and eat the dates anyway, savoring the sweetness that cuts briefly through the sour of your breath. Soon, your responsibilities expand. You are taught how to apply sand to the stone benches, how to mix oil and water in the right proportions for massage, how to fold towels in thirds, not halves, so they stack neatly without slipping. You're even allowed, once, to light the coals beneath the caldarium, the hot bath, a privilege normally reserved for the older boys. And though the flame singes your knuckle, you don't complain, because the sight of fire catching and growing in the damp gloom feels like a triumph. But the part that stays with you most, long after you leave the bathhouse and return to the more familiar rhythm of chamberpots and vinegar cloths, is the moment when a group of senators walk through the frigidarium, the cold room, their backs straight, their sandals squeaking on wet stone, and one of them, noticing you scrubbing the base of a marble pillar, makes a comment to his companion. Even the lowest hands keep Rome clean. He says it without looking at you, without pausing, his tone one of amusement rather than respect. But the phrase lingers, not because it's meant kindly, but because it's true. You realize then that your hands, cracked and wrinkled as they are, soaked in 1,000 unnamed fluids, calloused in all the wrong places, are part of the same machinery that fuels the empire's appetite for luxury. Without your hands, the baths would clog, the floors would fester, the benches would grow slippery and unsafe. Without your hands, Rome would itch beneath its marble mask, and though you'll never be thanked for it, never named in any scroll or story, the idea that your work is seen, even sideways, even muttered, even accidentally, gives you a strange and stubborn pride. After a week, you're sent back to your usual duties. Your father waiting at the alley's end with a fresh batch of pots and a shrug that says back to it. But you carry something new with you, something that doesn't weigh much but takes up space in your chest. You've been inside a place most in your class only smell from the outside. You've seen Rome scrubbed and steaming, heard its whispers, walked its slippery floors, and now, when you scrub a chamber pot, when you apply oil to the rim and sniff for completion, You do so with the memory of marble beneath your knees and a senator's voice in your ear. Even the lowest hands keep Rome clean. You smile just a little and get back to work. You will remember the day you spilled a senator's pot for the rest of your life. Not because of the actual mess, though there was plenty of that. An explosive, unmistakable cascade that splattered across the villa's mosaic threshold and oozed into the carefully tended gravel garden path like a slow-moving insult. But because of what it felt like in that awful, suspended moment, to be so utterly aware of your failure that you could feel your own heartbeat in the soles of your feet, and to understand, as clearly as a blow to the head, that you could not undo what had just happened, no matter how quickly you mopped or how desperately you tried to disappear behind your rag. It begins, as all disasters do, with the illusion of control. The morning is warm, but not hot. The sky pale and unbothered. The alley unusually quiet for that time of day. And your route takes you through the richer part of the neighborhood, where the houses stand taller and straighter, with marble thresholds and thick linen curtains drawn tight to keep out dust and common eyes. The pot you carry belongs to one of the newer residents, a senator's cousin, you think, though you've never been told his name directly, only referred to in hushed tones as the man with the silver dogs, because of the pair of decorative canines flanking his doorway, carved so lifelike you've nearly tripped over one more than once. It's a wide pot, made of bronze, polished to the point that even the distorted reflection of your anxious face ripples across its surface like a warning. The contents are heavy, oddly sloshy for its size, which suggests either a night of indulgent feasting or a recent illness no one wants to mention. You balance it carefully on your hip, one hand beneath the base, the other gripping the thick loop of the handle. And you walk slowly, with the practiced pace of someone who has done this dozens, hundreds of times. But the path is not quite level. A servant has left a stray garden tool in the walkway, half hidden beneath a tuft of decorative thyme, and your left foot catches it just as you shift your weight to turn the final step. The pot jolts forward. You lurch sideways. Your hand slips. And then it happens. Not dramatically, not with a crash or a scream, but with a dull, wet glug, the kind of sound that ends all hope before it's fully over, as the contents surge over the rim and splatter down in an arc that seems, for a second, impossibly slow. You try to steady it, try to tilt it back upright, but your momentum carries you forward, and you trip, landing hard on your knees in the senator's gravel path, the brush in your sash jabbing painfully into your ribs. The pot clatters beside you, still half full, spinning briefly before coming to rest with a mournful wobble, and then silence. Not the usual city silence filled with background noise, but a thick, waiting stillness, broken only by the faint trickle of liquid as it creeps toward the edge of the doorway. You don't dare look up at first, but you feel their presence. The senator, the servant, someone else in silk shoes, standing in the doorway, staring. You imagine their expressions: horror, disgust, maybe anger, maybe amusement. You brace for a shout, for a kick, for a command to leave and never return. Instead, there's a slow inhale, like someone drawing in breath through their nose in disbelief. "You people," someone says. Not loudly, not even cruelly, just flatly, like a statement of cosmic disappointment. You glance up, just enough to catch a glimpse of the speaker. A man in his 30s, clean-shaven, with a gold clasp on his belt and a wine cup in one hand, looking at you as if you were a stain that's bled through too many layers of cloth to be worth saving. You mutter an apology, the words tumbling out of your mouth half-formed, and reach for the cloth at your waist. But the damage is done. The pot is dented. The path is fouled. The senator's sandals, pristine white leather with gold-threaded laces, have been speckled. You lower your head, scoop what you can, mop furiously, rinse with a flask of vinegar you carry for emergencies, all the while burning with shame so deep it seems to warm your bones from within. You don't cry. You've learned not to, but your hands shake, and your mouth tastes like iron. The servant, older, kinder, or perhaps just tired, eventually shoos you away. "Go," he says, not unkindly. "I'll finish it." You stammer thanks, lift the empty pot, and stumble back into the alley, eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of failure pressing harder than the pot ever did. You return home with bruised knees, a split lip you didn't even notice, and a silence in your throat so heavy it takes you an hour to speak. Your father doesn't ask what happened. He sees it in your eyes, the way you sit too carefully, the way you clean your tools twice without needing to. He just grunts, pushes a crust of bread toward you, and says, "Happens once to everyone. Just don't let it happen again." But you do not forget. Not the sound, not the look, not the quiet finality of you people. And for days afterward, you carry your pots more carefully, walk more slowly, avoid that street entirely even when your route bends inconveniently wide. You replay the moment in your mind like a broken theater reel, analyzing the step, the tilt, the slack in your grip, wondering what you could have done differently, knowing, in truth, that nothing can ever truly prepare you for the surprise betrayals of uneven ground and distracted hands. The tooth you chipped when your jaw hit the brush handle begins to ache by the week's end. It doesn't break, but it throbs when you drink, and you start to chew on the other side of your mouth. You run your tongue along it when you walk, a small punishment, a physical reminder of what happens when you lose focus, when you forget that every step you take, every pot you carry, is part of a fragile, wobbling system where one misstep can turn you from a silent fixture of the city into a spectacle. And yet, Rome keeps eating, Rome keeps drinking, Rome keeps discarding, and so you keep working. The pots come full and urgent. You clean them, scrub them, rinse them, return them. One by one, the rhythm returns. Your balance improves, your steps steady. You build new instincts, calculate distances, scan pathways for obstacles, and eventually, quietly, you walk down that same street again. Not as a challenge, not as defiance, just because it's on the way. And when you pass the silver dogs, you glance down at the gravel, still faintly stained, despite the servant's best efforts. You don't linger, you don't pause, but you nod once, barely perceptible, like tipping your cap to an old scar. Later, when your mother checks your face in the low firelight and frowns at the bruise on your chin, you tell her it was a slip on wet stones. She clicks her tongue, tells you to wear thicker sandals, dabs a bit of wine-soaked linen to the sore, and says nothing more. She understands. She's dropped pots before. She's felt that same heat rise up her neck. That same silent judgment pressed down like a stone against the ribs. The shame lingers, but it loses its sharpness over time, softens into something instructional, a lesson etched into your posture, your timing, your anticipation. You begin to teach younger children in the alley how to grip a pot, how to tilt without spilling, how to brace their elbows and pace their steps. You pass on the details, the small things that matter, so that maybe if they're lucky, their moment of failure will come in private, somewhere without senators or decorative dogs. But you also know that failure is inevitable, that balance isn't a permanent state but a series of corrections, and that sometimes the world simply shifts beneath your feet and dares you to stay standing. And even if you fall, even if you spill, even if you leave behind a mess that stains your memory more than it stains the stones, you still get up. You still rinse the pot. You still carry the next one. Because Rome never stops, and neither do you. There is a particular kind of foolish optimism that belongs only to the young, a dangerous, glowing hope that flickers into being despite your upbringing, despite the stink that lingers permanently beneath your fingernails, despite the Chamberpot that left a bruise across your hip, and the chipped tooth that throbs every time you bite into bread that's more crust than crumb. And this strange lightness begins to stir inside you the day you meet the fish seller's daughter, who does not belong to your world, not exactly, but who brushes past its edges just often enough that your paths collide like dust motes meeting in the sunbeam of a particularly lucky morning. She is not beautiful in the sculpted, marble statue way that Roman poets sing about. She is not draped in saffron silk or ringed in gold, not the kind of girl who would be painted reclining on a mosaic floor with peeled grapes and scented oil. She is, instead, sharp-eyed and sun-browned, with salt in her hair and calluses on her palms from scaling eels and cracking mussels, and she walks with the assertive balance of someone who has never needed help carrying anything, not even herself. You first see her at the marketplace near the Subura, where the fishmongers shout louder than the butchers and the air is a cocktail of brine, blood, sweat, and lemon. She's slapping octopus tentacles against a marble counter to tenderize them, her arms flecked with water and tiny pieces of seaweed. And she doesn't look at you when you walk past, carrying a pot half full of someone else's aftermath. But you look at her, and something in your ribs shifts slightly, as if a pigeon had just fluttered against the inside of your chest. You don't speak to her at first, not because you're shy or because you don't want to, but because you've learned that people like you are not expected to initiate conversations with people like her, even if her job is only one notch above yours on the invisible scale of Roman cleanliness. Still, you find excuses to walk past the fish stalls more often, to loiter by the vinegar vendor's booth and pretend you're comparing prices, when really you're hoping for a glimpse of her hunched over a barrel or laughing with the garlic seller's niece. When you do finally speak, it's because of a cat, a mangy, battle-scarred thing that leaps suddenly from beneath a cart and sends her basket of sardines tumbling across the ground in a clatter of scales and curses. You're close enough to help, and you do, dropping your own burden and crouching to gather the fish, ignoring the smell that clings to them and to you already. Your fingers brushing hers once, briefly, and setting your heartbeat lurching into a rhythm you don't quite recognize. "Oh, careful," she says, and you think she means the cat. But her eyes linger on you for half a breath longer than necessary, and something inside you starts to bloom. slowly, cautiously, like a weed growing in a crack between stones. From that day on, she starts greeting you when she sees you. Not every time, not when others are watching, but often enough that your heart learns to listen for her voice amid the market's chaos. Her name is Livia. She has a scar on her forearm from a knife accident, and she laughs in short bursts like hiccups. She knows the best time to steal lemons from the orchard behind the temple, and she can gut a trout in less than 10 seconds. When she asks what you do, you lie a little. You say, "I help clean things," which is true, just not the whole truth, and she doesn't press. For a while, your meetings are fleeting. Shared glances, a nod, a muttered joke about the smell of salted mackerel versus Chamberpot vinegar. You steal scraps of time with her like a poor man gathering candle stubs, hoarding them in the corners of your memory. You offer her a dried fig once, and she surprises you by offering back a sliver of honey-cured eel, which you've never tasted and find strangely delicious. She smells of salt and smoke and sometimes lemons, and when she stands close to you, you forget, just for a moment, what you are. But the problem with Chamberpot washers is that the job clings, not just to your hands and your tunic and your sandals, but to your identity. And the illusion that you are simply someone who cleans things becomes harder to maintain with each passing day. One afternoon, while helping your father haul an unusually large pot from a multi-tenant insula, you spot her watching from across the street. She doesn't say anything, doesn't wave, but her eyes narrow slightly when she sees you lift the lid and pour out the contents into the runoff drain. And something cold presses itself gently against your spine. You want to explain, to yell across the noise and the carts and the pigeons that it's not all you are, that there's more to you than waste and vinegar. But the words stick, because part of you believes it might not be true. After that, she becomes more distant, still polite, still cordial. But the warmth dims just a fraction, and you feel it as acutely as if someone had pulled a warm blanket off your shoulders in the night. You still pass by the market, still catch glimpses of her, but now there's always someone else nearby. Her father, a merchant, a neighbor, and she never meets your eyes for long. You tell yourself it's nothing. You tell yourself it's just the changing of seasons, or her work, or that she's simply tired. But inside, you know, the magic of those brief weeks is slipping away, and you don't know how to hold on to it. Desperate, you do something foolish. You save your bread coins for a week, going slightly hungry, chewing old crusts with your sore molar, and purchase a small bottle of garum, the fermented fish sauce that the wealthy use in cooking, thinking, somehow, that if you offer her something rare, something nice, she will see you differently again. You present it awkwardly, wrapped in a cloth to hide the chipped edge of the bottle, your hands shaking slightly as you hold it out in the shadow of the fish stall. She looks at it, then at you, and for a moment, you think she might smile. Instead, she says gently, "I can't take that. My father would ask questions." And then softly, "You don't have to buy things. Just be careful." You nod, say nothing, leave the bottle on the ground by the stall, and walk away. She doesn't call after you, and the next time you pass through the market, she is not there. You try to move on, to return to the rhythm of your days, but something has shifted, not broken exactly, but rearranged, like a pot that has been scrubbed so many times that the glaze begins to wear thin. You still scrub. You still carry. You still know, in vivid detail, the difference between the waist of a man who eats pickled onions and one who eats goat stew. But your mind drifts. Your grip loosens. You drop a brush into a basin and don't even flinch when the splash soaks your sleeves. You think of her laugh, of the way she stood with her feet slightly apart, like she was always bracing for the world to tip. And then, one day, you pass the fish stall again. She's there, hair tied up, sleeves rolled, slicing into a pale-fleshed perch with the same precision as always. She doesn't look up, doesn't speak. But when you pass, she slides a small wrapped package to the edge of the table. You don't stop, not immediately. But later, once you've turned the corner and are alone, you unwrap it. Inside, a sliver of smoked eel and a lemon peel twisted into the shape of a heart. You sit on a stone wall and eat the eel slowly, feeling the salt sting your tongue, feeling something else entirely burn behind your ribs. It's not love, maybe. Or if it is, it's a quiet kind. The kind that lives in glances and silence and small shared acts between people who smell like vinegar and fish and know that even if their hands never touch again, for one strange, impossible moment, they belonged to the same sunbeam. Winter doesn't arrive in Rome all at once. It creeps in slowly, sneaking beneath doorways and into sleeves, settling in your bones before it shows itself in the sky. And for a few weeks, you try to pretend it's not coming. Tell yourself the mornings are just a little damp, that the air is crisp, not cold, that your breath isn't really fogging up as you lift the day's first pot. But then, one morning, you wake and realize that the air inside the courtyard is colder than the water in your cleaning basin, that the stone beneath your feet seems to bite instead of support, and that the handles of the chamber pots, normally warm from being held, are stiff, bitter cold, and lined with a thin, cruel layer of frost that seems to mock your bare hands with every brush of your skin. You learn quickly that frozen pots are not merely a nuisance, but a new category of challenge altogether. One that redefines your understanding of discomfort, of timing, and of danger. Because it's not just the smell that hardens in winter, it's the waste itself, congealing into semi-solid clumps that don't pour properly, don't rinse easily, don't respond to vinegar or scrubbing the way they used to, and instead resist removal like a stubborn stain on your pride. The first time you crack a pot, it's because you underestimated how quickly water freezes when left in a bronze basin overnight. You lift the lid, tap the rim with your ladle out of habit, and the surface inside, frozen nearly solid, sends a hairline fracture through the base with an almost delicate ping. You watch helplessly as it leaks from beneath, a slow, thick drip that leaves a smear of shame all the way to the drainage gutter. And you spend the rest of the day apologizing to your father, who says nothing but adds the cost of a new pot to your already imaginary debts. Frost gathers in odd places, on the handles of brushes, on the rims of vinegar flasks, even once on your eyebrow, which you don't notice until a droplet melts and runs down your cheek, convincing you for a brief moment that you might be crying. You are not. Not yet, anyway. But your fingers swell with cold, your joints stiffen, and every morning feels like a battle with your own limbs, as if your body is still asleep even when your feet are splashing in wash water before the sun rises. You begin wrapping your hands in strips of old linen, stuffing them with dry moss for insulation, and your mother, always practical, gives you a lump of beeswax to rub on your fingertips at night, claiming it seals the blood in. Whether that's true or not, you never find out, but the ritual comforts you, and so you keep it up. Like a charm against the freeze, frozen pots make new sounds. Not the familiar slosh and thunk of warmer months, but sharp cracks, hollow thuds, and on particularly cold mornings, a kind of eerie echo when you tap the side with your knuckle, as if the pot has become a bell and you are ringing it to call forth the gods of frost and foulness. One morning, you carry a particularly heavy load to the disposal trench and find that the waste inside has frozen solid enough to maintain the exact shape of the pot after tipping, like a mold pulled clean from its cast. You stare at it, transfixed by how something so wretched can look almost beautiful when rigid and untouched. A sculpture of decay shaped by cold, then smash it with a stick so you can fit it down the chute, and laugh aloud for the first time in days when it breaks apart like some grotesque confection. Your laughter echoes down the alley, and you stop immediately, suddenly aware of how rare that sound has become, how unfamiliar it feels in your throat. No one else is laughing. Your father is coughing into his sleeve behind the basin. Your mother hasn't spoken in hours. The neighbors are silent, bundled beneath layers of damp cloth, their breath rising in little puffs of shared misery. The whole city seems slowed by the cold, its marble fangs dulled by frost, its streets quieter than usual, except for the groans of carts dragging reluctant oxen through patches of ice and the occasional clang of a pot slipping from numb fingers and shattering into 100 echoes. You learn to anticipate which pots are more likely to freeze, just as in summer you learn to recognize which ones ferment. Clay freezes faster than bronze. Smaller pots, oddly enough, freeze deeper than large ones because they cool more evenly. You begin to time your route differently, cleaning from the east-facing courtyards first, where the morning sun might catch a handle or two and chase the worst of the chill away, then circling back through the shaded alleys last, when your fingers are already numb and your mind has settled into that strange, automatic rhythm that keeps your body moving even when your thoughts are miles away, chasing warmth in some impossible fantasy involving a hot spring, a roof that doesn't leak, and a bowl of porridge not laced with vinegar. The worst part is not the cold itself, or the ice, or the brittle pain in your knuckles when you knock a frozen lid loose with a stick. It's the water. Water, which you usually love for its cleansing power, becomes your enemy. It freezes inside your buckets, turns your brushes rigid, seeps into your tunic, and then turns to needles against your ribs. You try to keep your hands dry, but that's impossible in your line of work, and so you adjust. You begin to shake your fingers every few minutes like you've seen the washerwomen do, slapping them against your thighs until they tingle. And when that fails, you tuck them under your arms during breaks, blowing on them with breath that carries the scent of vinegar, ash, and wet wool. Your mother tells you stories about her first winter working, how she once lost the feeling in 2 toes for nearly a month and walked with a limp until the thaw. She lifts her foot now and shows you. The smallest toe is still grayish blue, discolored by time and nerve damage, and you stare at it with grim fascination, imagining your own future mapped out in discolored limbs and crumbling fingernails. It comes back, she says, most of it, You just have to keep moving. And so you do. You learn to walk differently in winter. Shorter steps, more careful balance, always testing the ground ahead with your toe like a blind man with a stick. The alleys you once navigated blindfolded become treacherous obstacle courses, where a single slip can send you tumbling, pot and all, into a patch of frozen muck that will leave your clothes stiff for days. You fall twice in a single week, bruising your thigh once and cutting your knee the second time. And both times you swear softly under your breath. Not loud enough for anyone to hear, but enough to steam the inside of your mouth with frustration. And yet, there is something strangely beautiful about the cold, if you allow yourself to see it. The way the early light catches on frost-covered bricks. The silence of the city before it fully wakes. The moment when a frozen pot lets go its contents with a satisfying thud, like a solved puzzle. You begin to appreciate the warmth of vinegar, of breath, of anything at all. And you huddle closer to the fire at night, grateful for its crackle, for its smoke that chases the chill from your bones even as it stings your eyes. On one particularly bitter morning, you wake before the sun and find that your father has already lit the brazier and left a wrapped brick of hot ash near your sleeping mat. A rare kindness he says nothing about. You carry it beneath your tunic for most of the day, pressed against your ribs, and you think, not for the first time, that sometimes love is not words or smiles or even presence, but heat. Shared, silent, unexpected. Winter teaches you to endure. It makes your movements slower, your thoughts deeper, your awareness sharper. You begin to value every dry cloth, every uncracked pot, every cup of warm wine stolen in silence from a tavern's forgotten corner. You speak less, listen more. You learn to sense weather by smell, by pressure, by the way dogs sleep curled tighter than usual. You dream of spring, not in color, not in sound, but as warmth, as a concept, a promise, a return. And all the while, the pots do not stop coming, because Rome may burn or freeze, feast or starve, march to war or collapse beneath its own weight. But it always, always needs cleaning. There are days, especially as your back begins to stiffen earlier in the morning than it used to, and your knees take just a moment longer to lock into place after squatting too long beside a cracked basin, when you begin to understand, with a creeping sort of resignation that doesn't arrive all at once, but rather settles in stages like moisture behind a wall, that this work is not something you are merely doing until something else comes along, that there is no other waiting just out of reach, no invitation to a different life hanging in the air like steam in the bathhouse, no hidden lineage waiting to be revealed that would lift you from the gutters and install you into a marble villa with perfumed lamps and personal scribes, but rather that these pots, this ache, these cracked fingernails and linen-wrapped hands and vinegar burns on the forearms, is the path, the whole road, from one end to the other. And in that moment, when you stop thinking of this work as a phase or punishment and begin to accept it as something like a calling, albeit a grimy, unglamorous one, you start to notice things you hadn't paid attention to before. Not because they weren't there, but because you weren't ready to see them. Weren't in the right state of stillness to perceive the subtle, quiet poetry of repetition. The strange comfort in the circularity of it all. Lift, carry, pour, rinse, scrub, polish, repeat. You realize that your back doesn't just ache for no reason. It aches because it has learned the shape of the city, the weight of its waste, the contours of each alley and courtyard, and it carries those maps in the muscles that now knot more easily than before. Yes, but also more wisely. You find yourself developing rituals not out of necessity, but out of a desire to impose meaning on the mundane. You always clean the first pot of the day with your best brush, the one with the handle worn smooth by your thumb. You save a strip of clean linen to wipe the final pot before sunset. A private ceremony that no one else witnesses, but one that brings you a flicker of closure, a signal that the day is done, and you have once again carried the city's filth on your back without dropping it. And though no gods descend to thank you, no household statues nod in appreciation, and no passerby ever pauses to say, "Well done," you begin to feel something very close to pride. Not the boastful, chest-swelling kind, but the quiet, marrow-deep kind. The sort that allows you to look at your reflection in a basin of water and think, I am not useless. Your strength, once something you barely noticed, now announces itself not in your biceps or your stride, but in your durability. Your ability to withstand without complaint, to bend without snapping. You begin to understand why your father grunted instead of speaking, why your mother measured love in gestures instead of words, why the old woman on the third floor who used to sell boiled turnips now spends her days just sitting and watching the street, nodding occasionally to herself as though confirming that the world still turns as long as the pots are emptied on time. There's a rhythm to survival, a drumbeat under the noise of everything else. And once you tune yourself to it, you can endure almost anything. Your spine, however, tells a different story. It creaks now when you rise too quickly. It locks up after carrying too many pots without pausing. You begin to sleep not stretched out on your mat, but curled sideways, knees drawn in, arms beneath your head, as if protecting the very core of your being from the weight of another day. You've started waking in the middle of the night with a jolt of pain along your lower back, and when it happens, you lie still for several minutes, staring into the dark, trying to decide whether it's worse to stay where you are or to sit up and stretch. Most of the time, you stay still, not because it's better, but because you're tired in ways that stretching can't fix. And yet somehow, you keep moving. You rise, you rinse your face, you take the first pot and check for cracks, you test the brush bristles, inspect the vinegar flask, knot the sash around your waist. The pain becomes part of the ritual. A warning, perhaps, but also a reminder that you are here, that you are alive, that you are working. There are moments when the pain flares so sharply that you grip the side of a pot not to steady it, but to steady yourself, pressing your weight into the cold bronze or clay as if hoping it might absorb some of your own fragility. You clench your teeth and continue, refusing to limp, refusing to draw attention, because the moment you admit the pain aloud, it becomes realer, more permanent, something others can point to and say, he's not what he used to be. And in your world, being not what you used to be is a death sentence served slowly and without ceremony. You meet others who feel the same. The gutter cleaner who walks with a twist in his step but never stops shoveling. The water bearer with the crooked shoulder who jokes about his limp as though it were a badge of honor. The laundry boy who wraps his wrists in waxed cloth because the soap has eaten away his skin. You see them and nod, the way veterans do, acknowledging the shared truth without needing to speak it. You begin to measure a man's worth, not by his coin pouch or his title, but by how straight he stands when lifting something heavy, and how little he complains afterward. And the pots themselves begin to carry new meaning. You start to recognize them not just by owner or shape, but by the particular strain they place on your body. The wide-rimmed bronze pot from the merchant's house pinches your right shoulder. The squat clay one from the midwife's floor makes your hip twinge. The tall, narrow urn used by the baker's family is oddly balanced and always leaves your left wrist sore. But you carry them all anyway, and you learn how to shift your weight subtly, how to rest one elbow on a knee when setting them down, how to stretch without drawing attention to the fact that what you're really doing is buying time between aches. Your tools evolve with you. The handle of your best brush snaps one day, right in the middle of a scrub, and you nearly weep. Not because you can't fix it, but because it had molded itself to your hand over years, its curve as familiar as your own fingers. You carve a new one, slower this time, soaking the wood in oil, shaping it carefully, sanding it smooth, then wrapping the base in linen soaked in wax to keep the fibers from loosening. It isn't the same, not yet, but it will be. You can feel it settling into its role, adapting, just like you did. And on days when the pain threatens to outweigh the pride, when the weight of the city's filth feels like it might finally press you flat, you remind yourself of the truth. Rome depends on you. Not by name, not in song, but in the invisible machinery of its daily function. You are part of that mechanism, essential, reliable, irreplaceable in your own quiet way. You don't ask for thanks. You've long stopped expecting it. But once, as you bend to lift a particularly stubborn pot left outside a wealthy household, a boy, not yet 10, emerges from the doorway and watches you in silence. You glance up, expecting the usual sneer, the wrinkle of the nose, but instead, he tilts his head and asks, "Is it heavy?" And you, surprised by the question, answer honestly, "Yes, sometimes." He nods solemnly, then disappears inside. You carry the pot away, and for the rest of the day, your back still aches, but not quite as bitterly, because someone noticed, someone asked, someone saw. By the time you reach your later teen years, though you've never truly counted the seasons as neatly as some do, since years in your world are measured less by age than by the number of pots lifted, joints cracked, and fingers calloused, you begin to realize that your world, vast as it feels when your back is bent beneath the city's most unpleasant burdens, is in fact just one part of a hidden network of workers like you, each one occupying their own small corner of Rome's vast and humming underbelly, connected not by name or family, but by trade, by the silent glances exchanged when passing each other in the alleys before sunrise, by the way they examine your hands with a glance and know instantly what you carry, how you carry it, and how long you've been doing it. The first of these unspeaking comrades you meet is a boy not much older than you. His face burned dark from hours beneath the open sky, his tunic stiff with dried river water, who you see one morning emptying what looks like a broken amphora into the mouth of a sewer just past the forum's east wall. He doesn't look up when you pass, and you don't stop. But something about the familiarity of his motions, The way he leans his weight forward slightly, just enough to avoid sloshing the last inch of waste down his shin, tells you that he's no amateur, that he's emptied more pots than he's had warm meals, and you feel for the first time that you are not entirely alone in your particular corner of the empire. Soon, you begin to notice more of them, boys and men, and occasionally women, moving like shadows in the early light, each with their own load, their own method, their own scent and gait and rhythm. There are the sewer boys, filthy from the knees down, always carrying long hooks and shovels, their backs curved like river stones, who disappear for hours at a time into the city's stomach and return smelling of mold and sulfur and damp despair. There are the pipemen, who wear heavier tunics and often walk in pairs, dragging stone tools or bronze rods used to unclog the water lines beneath the wealthier districts, and who speak very little except in whistles and clicks, a code of taps and tones they say is more efficient in the echoing tunnels. And there are the latrine runners, like yourself, chamberpot haulers and cleaners, those who bear the load not underground, but openly, whose shame is public, whose work is seen but never acknowledged. Eventually, you begin to speak to one. His name, when he finally shares it after 3 days of nods and passing grunts, is Morrow. He's taller than you, thinner too, with a long face and a scar across one cheekbone that makes his mouth appear permanently crooked, even when he's not smiling, which is rare but unforgettable. You meet him while both of you are scrubbing pots beside a rainwater cistern that's been left unlocked in a side alley behind a bakery, a place both of you have apparently been sneaking into for years without ever noticing the other. He watches you for a while before saying, without looking away from his work, "You ever clean one so bad you gag 3 days later just remembering it?" And you laugh, a short, sharp bark that echoes off the bricks. Because yes, you have. And you know then that Morrow understands the job in the same way you do. Not just the mechanics of it, but the psychology, the bizarre intimacy with waste, the way it imprints on your brain, creeps into your dreams, follows you even after you've scrubbed your hands raw. He becomes your friend. Not in the open, boyish way that children latch onto each other, but in the way of tradesmen, of weary soldiers who find camaraderie in the dirt they share. You trade tips. He shows you how to lace a strip of wool through your sash to keep your back warmer in the cold months. And you teach him how to mix olive ash with lemon peel to soften old bronze stains. You compete silently to see who can scrub faster, who can balance more pots at once without spilling, who can detect the diet of a client based on smell alone. You never speak of your families, of your pasts, or of the future. Only of tools, routes, strange clients, odd discoveries. You share bread and sometimes wine, and once, on a holiday when work slows for a few hours, you both sit against a sun-warmed wall and talk about the most ridiculous things you've ever found in a pot. He once discovered a small coin, pressed flat by pressure or perhaps chewed by accident. And you once cleaned out what could only be described as a pigeon's feather, intact, floating in a sea of awful mystery. It is through Morrow that you learn about the rivalries, the unofficial territories, the unspoken rules of the waste trade. Certain alleys belong to certain families, he tells you. And if you begin to collect or dump outside your zone, you might find your vinegar stolen, your brushes frayed, or worse, a slop bucket tipped into your sleeping corner at night. The sewer boys, in particular, are fiercely territorial. They believe themselves to be the truest filth bearers, the ones who face the darkest depths of Rome, and they mock the surface cleaners, like you, for only dealing with shallow dirt. You and Morrow laugh about this, because there is no shallow dirt, only layers, and you know well enough that cleaning a senator's night pot at dawn can feel far more degrading than scraping a drain full of bathhouse runoff. Still, tensions simmer. One afternoon, Morrow comes to your cleaning spot with a split lip and dried blood on his knuckles. He says nothing at first, just starts scrubbing, faster than usual, more aggressively. You don't ask. You know. The pipemen have been encroaching again, claiming they have rights to the western side of the market, and someone must have crossed a line, or refused a bribe, or simply carried a pot a few meters too far. No one will report it. No one ever does, but everyone will remember. And then, of course, there are the stories. Every waste handler knows them. Whispers about a boy who fell into a cistern and drowned in a week-old mess. A girl who was crushed when a stone pot slipped off a ledge. A man who died of fever because he cut his hand on a cracked rim and the filth seeped into his blood. You and Morrow share these stories like prayers, like warnings, half believing, half disbelieving, using them to shape your caution, your routine, your respect for the job. Because in the end, you've both come to understand the same truth. The pots may be simple, but the work is not. The work is layered with danger, with politics, with unspeakable risks that live in the shadows between one spill and the next. Sometimes, you and Morrow walk home together. Not every night, and never side by side like friends, but in the same direction, a few paces apart, heads down, tools wrapped and tucked beneath your tunics. The silence between you is companionable. You don't talk about dreams or wives or gods, but once, when the moon is bright and the streets unusually still, he says, "You think there'll ever be a time when people do this with pipes or drains or something that doesn't need a boy with a bucket?" And you shrug, unsure if you hope for such a future or fear being made obsolete by it. "Maybe," you say, "but not for us." And that's the end of it. Because Rome, for all its aqueducts and engineers and clever ideas, still runs on the labor of hands like yours. Rough, stained, cracked, enduring. You know that whatever inventions come, whatever clever system some senator proposes, it will still be someone's job to carry, to scrub, to pour. And until that changes, you will carry your pots. You will nod to the sewer boys. You will trade vinegar tricks with the pipe men. You will keep to your alley and defend your corner. You will share bread with Morrow when there's bread to share, and stories when there's silence too thick to bear alone. Because this is Rome. And Rome needs its cleaners just as much as it needs its senators and soldiers and scribes. Maybe more. There's a story whispered around certain alleys of the city, never in broad daylight, never loudly, and always with a subtle glance over the shoulder, as if the tale itself might cause offense to someone who shouldn't be listening. About a man named Publius, a name that wouldn't otherwise stand out in Rome, where every other person seems to be called Publius, Gaius, or Lucius. But this particular Publius is remembered with a mixture of awe, confusion, and begrudging admiration because, as the story goes, he started out just like you. A boy born behind a tavern with nothing but vinegar on his breath and a chamber pot in his arms. and somehow ended up with the title of Curator Cloacarum, which, though it might not sound impressive to someone outside the trade, is nothing less than the highest office in the empire's sewer administration. The man who literally controlled the flow of filth beneath the greatest city in the world. You first hear the tale from an old cloth dyer named Vibia, who lives 2 floors above your family's quarters and who has a habit of talking to her pigeons in the same tone she uses for gossip. She tells you, between mouthfuls of soaked lentils, that Publius was born in Transtiberum, a rough neighborhood across the river where even Chamberpot washers had to fight for turf, and that he earned his first coin not by cleaning pots, but by sneaking into the Cloaca Maxima with a rope and a torch to retrieve a ring dropped by the son of a rich merchant, a job no one else dared to take because the tunnels had collapsed in that section and were said to be full of snakes and gas that could put a man to sleep forever. But Publius went down anyway, came back up 2 hours later covered in black sludge and holding the ring between his teeth. And from that day forward, people started to remember his name. Over the years, the story becomes clearer in your mind, or perhaps more elaborate, shaped by each new voice that tells it, each old washerman who adds a detail or exaggerates a danger. But the core of it always remains the same. Publius wasn't just good at cleaning. He understood waste, respected it, saw it not as filth, but as a force, a living river of the city's truth that needed to be guided, tamed, honored even, if Rome was to remain standing above it. They say he studied the patterns of the runoff like a priest reads entrails, tracked where the bathhouses flowed and where the market drains clogged, memorized the crooked arteries of Rome's underbelly better than any engineer or architect. When the Tiber overflowed one spring and backed up all the southern sewers, he's said to have mapped the blockage using a stick and a piece of charcoal, and then led a crew of slaves and hired cleaners into the tunnels for 3 straight days, sleeping in shifts and eating nothing but boiled cabbage until the water ran free again. Some claim he was promoted by a grateful magistrate. Others say he blackmailed a senator whose daughter once fainted from the smell of her own chamber. One version insists he saved the emperor's favorite bathhouse from flooding and was rewarded with a golden ladle, though that last part always makes people laugh too hard to believe it. Regardless of the details, you learn that by the end of his career, Publius no longer carried pots or scrubbed rims himself, but rode in a cart pulled by donkeys through the lower avenues, attended by 2 scribes and a servant who carried a silver-engraved bucket of fresh water just for his hands. He inspected drains, directed restorations, approved the construction of new flow channels, and yet, it's said, he never forgot where he came from. They say he always wore his old sash around his waist beneath the toga, the same one he used to tie his brushes with as a boy, and that he never passed a potman in the street without nodding first. You wonder sometimes, how much of it is true? Whether a boy like you could ever truly rise that high, without noble blood or coin to bribe a path through the Senate doors. Your father, when you ask him, only grunts and says, "Every story's got a shine on it. Doesn't mean there's no truth under the polish." Your mother, more cautious, tells you not to get ideas, not because she doubts you, but because she's seen what happens to boys who look too high while their hands are still covered in grime. "Ambition's fine," she says, rubbing salve into your wrists after a long day. "But don't mistake it for a ladder. Sometimes it's just a bigger bucket to carry. Still, you think about Publius when you work. When you notice how the runoffs bubble slower near the market drain. When you map routes in your head to avoid clashing with the sewer boys. When you adjust your technique not because someone told you to, but because you've begun to feel the flow of the job in your bones. You start keeping small notes, scratched onto broken tiles or etched into the wood of your brush handles. Reminders about which clients produce the hardest waste to scrub, which streets are slickest after rain, which drains back up if you dump too fast. You joke that you're becoming the next Publius, and Morrow laughs, but not in a mocking way. If you do, he says, just remember who carried your vinegar flask the day your foot slipped in the vomit ditch. What fascinates you most about the legend of Publius isn't his rise to power, or even the improbability of it. It's the idea that someone from your world, someone whose hands were shaped by the same weight, the same stink, the same humiliations, could command respect without ever leaving the filth behind. He didn't escape it. He elevated it, transformed it into something Rome couldn't laugh at or ignore. And maybe that's what you want, in your own unspoken way. Not to be clean, not to be rich, but to make your work undeniable. To turn what others wrinkle their noses at into something they depend on, something they must acknowledge. To be visible without apology. So you start working differently. Not faster, not more frantically, but more intentionally. You test new mixtures of ash and lemon peel to break down stubborn rings. You start using a different rinsing sequence for bronze pots than for clay, noting how the metals react to heat and cold. You study how the gutter channels curve, which ones drain faster, which ones clog when the moon is full and the tides shift ever so slightly. You begin offering suggestions, quietly, respectfully, to a few regular clients about how to store their pots overnight to reduce buildup. And to your surprise, some of them listen. One even thanks you. You don't expect praise. You don't seek it. But when a merchant nods and says, "Cleaner work this time," or a tenant leaves a second coin beside the step, you feel it. Not as flattery, but as recognition. As evidence that the work is being seen, not merely tolerated. The name Publius stays with you, not as a goal exactly, but as a question. What if it is possible? What if someone has to start the next map, the next flowchart, the next evolution of your kind of work? Rome isn't static. It grows, twists, collapses, and rebuilds. And maybe, just maybe, you could be one of the quiet architects of that change. Not from a marble bench in the Senate, but from the gutters where you've always belonged. And whether Publius ever really wore a golden ladle around his neck, or rode through the streets on a donkey-drawn cart with scribes and sandals cleaner than a temple floor, that matters less than the idea of him. The idea that there's dignity in mastery, even if the thing you've mastered is filth. Because at the end of the day, the pot must be carried. The waste must be scrubbed. The drain must be cleared. And someone has to know how to do it better than anyone else. The wooden ladle isn't particularly beautiful, nor is it especially large or well-crafted. It's slightly curved at the handle from years of gripping. The bowl end is worn down from hundreds of rinses, stained dark in patches from contact with vinegar, lye, and things better left unnamed. And there are faint initials scratched into the underside, letters so faded you can barely tell if they were carved on purpose or if they're just the remnants of someone's idle fidgeting during a long afternoon of scrubbing. But it is yours now. handed to you not with ceremony or speech, but with a simple gesture one morning as your father finishes tying the final knot in the cord that keeps his apron closed, turns towards you and presses the ladle into your palm with a hand rougher than bark. Eyes neither proud nor dismissive, but steady, unreadable. And as he turns back to the basin, all he says is, "Don't drop it." That's it. No feast, no family gathering, no declaration of responsibility or rite of passage. Just an old tool passed from one hand to another in the half-light of dawn, in a corner of Rome that smells like wet stone, burned olive oil, and the lingering bitterness of spoiled barley. And yet, you feel something stir in your chest as you curl your fingers around the handle. Something warm and strange and unexpected, as if the weight of the ladle isn't just physical, but historical, as though every man in your family who ever scrubbed a pot had gripped it just the same, had soaked their skin in the same basin water, had whispered the same curses when the bristles fell apart mid-cleaning. It isn't just a tool, it's a symbol, not in the grand sense of banners or crowns, but in the quiet, heavy way that a key means something only if you know what door it opens. You spend the rest of the morning working with that ladle as though it were new, unfamiliar, learning its balance, the way it scoops, the way it needs to be held just slightly tilted to avoid a sideways drip, the way the wood creaks if you grip it too hard. It doesn't make the work easier, nothing ever does, but it makes it yours. And that changes the rhythm somehow. You notice things you hadn't before. How the circular motion of the rinse is more efficient if done with the wrist rather than the elbow. How the angle of the brush against the bottom of a bronze pot determines whether the residue lifts and swirls or flakes. How the scum collects more stubbornly around decorative carvings and requires a smaller, firmer brush to reach. And every time you dip the ladle, scoop a rinse, pour a stream, you feel connected, not just to your father, who still watches silently from the other side of the courtyard, but to the whole invisible line of workers before you, those who bore the stink and the burden and the silence long before your first breath. That evening, after the pots are scrubbed and the tools dried and stored, you take the ladle back to your corner and inspect it under the wavering firelight, turning it slowly in your hands like it might reveal some secret if held just right. The initials, if they are initials, catch your eye again, and you trace them gently with your thumb, wondering whose name they once stood for. Your grandfather? An uncle you never met? Or someone before even them, someone whose name was forgotten but whose mark remained, burned into the wood like a ghost's whisper. You feel a strange urge to add your own mark, to carve something beside the fading letters. Just a single line maybe, a curve, nothing too obvious, but you hesitate. The ladle isn't just yours yet. It's still becoming yours. Tools, like people, take time to trust. Over the following weeks, the ladle becomes a fixture of your day. You clean it after every use. You wrap it in linen at night. You oil the handle once a week with a drop of olive pressed from the last of the spoiled fruit in the alley vendor's cart. And when someone, one of the newer boys, clumsy and curious, reaches for it without asking, you react faster than you thought possible, snatching it from his hands with a look that requires no words, just a tilt of the brow that says plainly, "That's mine." He doesn't try again, and in time, the ladle begins to carry its own history with you. There's the day it slips from your grip and bounces twice before landing handle down in a pile of spilled fat, which you clean furiously, muttering to yourself, feeling irrationally guilty for the rest of the afternoon. There's the week you work alongside a visiting cleaner from Ostia who scoffs at your use of a ladle, claiming he uses only buckets and elbow grease. But later, when he's not looking, you catch him admiring the smoothness of the pour and the precision of your rinse. There's the night it almost burns in the brazier because you laid it too close to the coals, too tired to notice. And your father, wordlessly, reaches over with a stick to push it away, nodding once as if to say, "Even old things need watching." You begin to dream differently. In your sleep, the ladle appears, not as a tool, but as a kind of staff, a baton passed in secret, a scepter of the unseen kingdom you and your family rule, a symbol of mastery not recognized by emperors or chroniclers, but by gutters and grates and those who know what it means to clean what others leave behind. You wake one morning with the distinct sensation that the ladle has weight in your dream that matches its weight in your hand. And for the rest of the day, your movements are steadier, your steps more assured, as if part of you has begun to understand that ownership is not just a matter of possession, but of acceptance, of responsibility, of belief. And perhaps that's what your father meant when he said, "Don't drop it." Not just physically, though of course there's always the danger of splinters or cracks if wood hits stone, but symbolically, spiritually, historically. Don't drop the work. Don't drop the standard. Don't drop the memory of the hands that came before. Don't drop yourself. Eventually, people begin to notice. The merchant's wife, who once wrinkled her nose at you, now leaves her pot out on time, lid polished, handle facing forward. The temple porter who used to grumble at your pace now grunts approval when you pass. Even Morrow, who has never once complimented anyone on anything, glances at your ladle one morning and says, "That wood's aging well," almost looks proud of you. You laugh, of course, say something self-deprecating, but later, when no one's watching, you run your fingers along the edge of the bowl and think, maybe it is. You begin to feel older. Not old in the way of gray hair or bent spines, but older in the sense that time has started to loop back on itself. You see new boys enter the trade, faces smudged with ash, eyes wide, shoulders unsure, and you remember yourself in them. Remember the weight of your first pot, the chill of your first frozen handle, the sting of your first cracked knuckle. You want to tell them things, not everything, not too much, because everyone must find their own rhythm, but little things. How to brace the brush, how to sniff without gagging, how to stretch before lifting. And once, when one of them fumbles and almost drops a small clay pot onto the stone, you catch it mid-fall, straighten, and, without thinking, say, "Don't drop it." And he nods. Just like you did, just like it never stopped being said. There comes a certain point in every washer's life, though few speak of it, and even fewer admit when it happens, when the motion of the work becomes so deeply etched into the body that it ceases to be something you do and becomes something you are. Not in the poetic sense of calling or destiny, but in the practical, physical, and almost inevitable sense of muscle memory and ingrained rhythm. As if your hands have absorbed the logic of the work and now act independently of conscious thought. moving brush and ladle and cloth with the effortless fluency of breathing, even while your mind drifts off to count chimney bricks or follow the swaying of a hanging laundry sheet in the breeze. And you realize, with a strange mix of pride and weariness, that you could probably clean a chamber pot in complete darkness now and get every curve right. This isn't necessarily a cause for celebration. There is no applause, no certificate, no official moment where someone declares, "You've done it. You're now a master washer." It happens quietly, almost without you knowing. One rinse blending into another, one basin echoing yesterday's splash, and the transformation is so subtle that it's only when a visiting cleaner from another district pauses to watch you work and mutters something like, "Fast hands," or "You make that look easy," that you blink and realize how long it's been since you had to think about the process at all. And yet mastery does not equal freedom. If anything, it means deeper entanglement, because the better you become at the job, the more the job becomes yours. Trusted, assumed, expected, and people start to rely on you in ways they never did before. Not with words or formalities, but with tiny gestures. A pot left slightly closer to your path. A cloth laid out just the way you like it. A nod from a neighbor who doesn't speak your name, but hands you a fresh bar of soap from the market anyway, muttering something about, "You'll make better use of it than me." You begin to be called for the difficult ones, the ones others avoid or ruin or give up on halfway through. Pots that haven't been scrubbed in weeks, bronze ones with green film and sour buildup, ornamental ones with delicate rims that crack under heavy hands, ceremonial ones used by priestesses who insist on rituals before and after. One day, you're sent to clean the marble basin of a retired senator who claims that regular vinegar leaves behind spiritual residue, and you must invent a whole new mixture: citrus rind, boiled barley water, and a whisper of crushed rose petals, just to satisfy his whims, which you do, not because you believe in his theories, but because you've grown skilled in managing the egos that cling to the other end of the pot as tightly as the filth clings inside it. Morrow notices the change before you do. "You've gone soft," he says one morning, grinning as he watches you tie a second cloth around your ladle handle to prevent scratching an engraved rim. Next thing I know, you'll be oiling your buckets and giving them names. But his eyes betray a flicker of respect, maybe even envy. He's good, of course. Steady, strong, loyal. But you've taken a different path. One that requires precision as much as strength, restraint as much as repetition. And perhaps that's why, when a local magistrate's steward comes sniffing around the neighborhood in search of a reliable handler for delicate sanitation needs, it's your name that gets whispered over the stone walls. The first time you're invited into a domus, a true Roman house, with atrium and impluvium and marble statues that serve no purpose other than to be looked at, you are almost too cautious, stepping lightly as if the floor might crack beneath your workers' feet. The servant who leads you in does not speak to you beyond the initial instructions, and the pot you're meant to clean is brought out on a wheeled tray as if it's too sacred to be handed off directly. You kneel, rinse, scrub, rinse again, dry, polish, and all the while you feel the weight of invisible eyes watching. Not because they care about your technique, but because they're making sure you don't touch anything else. Don't speak, don't wonder, don't exist beyond your assigned square of floor. But you do the job, and you do it well. And a week later, you're called again. Eventually, word spreads, because word always spreads in Rome, faster than the Tiber floods, and soon you find yourself with a new tier of clients. Those who don't just want their pots cleaned, but want them done by you, specifically, quietly, precisely, with no fuss and no smell and no reminders that human waste ever existed inside those vessels in the first place. You begin carrying an extra cloth, one for drying and one for polishing. You invest, yes, invest, though the word feels odd in your mouth, in a better brush, one with imported bristles that don't fray after the third rinse. You polish your ladle until it gleams faintly in the morning sun. You even wash your tunic more often, not because it matters to the pots, but because it matters to the perception of the person holding the ladle. And yet, despite the elevation of your work, your world remains the same. Your room is still the same corner under the staircase. Your meals are still lentils, stale crusts, and the occasional olive when someone's generous. Your hands are still stained, your back still sore. Your knees still know the stones of every alley in the district. What's changed, truly, is how you move through it all. With quieter steps, with practiced grace, with an odd sort of pride that you never thought Chamberpots could inspire, but which now hums beneath your skin like the echo of a well-scrubbed rim. One evening, as the sun casts long shadows across the cobblestones, and the air smells faintly of roasted chestnuts from a vendor 3 streets over, your father watches you wring out your cloth with a flick of the wrist so smooth it could be mistaken for a flourish. He doesn't say anything at first, just nods once, then turns to pour water over his own basin. But after a moment, without looking up, he says, "You move like a man who's not afraid of what he touches anymore." You pause, think, and you realize he's right. There was a time when the job repulsed you. Not just the smell or the mess, but the idea of it. The way people recoiled when you passed. The shame that stuck harder than the grime ever did. But somewhere between the ladle and the rinse, somewhere in the 1,000 repetitions, the job has changed you. Not by removing the filth, but by teaching you how to carry it, how to master it, how to turn it into something useful, something needed, something respected, if only in whispers. You still remember Publius, of course. Still think about that carved ladle of legend. Still wonder if he ever dreamed, as you now do, of leaving behind something that mattered. Not fame, not wealth, just continuity. A way of work that could be passed down, refined, made worthy, and you begin to imagine teaching someone. Not yet, but someday. Maybe a boy who trips over his own bucket, who asks too many questions, who holds a brush like a chicken bone. Someone who looks up at you with that same mix of dread and wonder you once had for your father's hands. Someone to pass the ladle to when the time comes. But not yet. For now, you scrub. For now, you polish. For now, you work with hands that know the job better than they know rest. And when the last pot is clean, and the ladle is hung just right, and the bucket's rim is wiped dry, you sit on the stone step outside your doorway and breathe deep, not in relief, but in rhythm, with the work, with the city, with the quiet power of doing something well, even when no one watches, especially then. By the time the first gray streaks begin to settle near your temples, so faint they could be dismissed as dust from the brick oven next door, or stray flour from the baker's boy sprinting past with his morning loaves. You've long since ceased to measure your life in years or seasons or even birthdays, which you stopped counting sometime around your 20th pot. Instead, you now mark the passage of time through the slow, evolving language of tools, through the wear patterns on your ladle's handle, the shifting sound of rinse water echoing off newer clay, the thickening of your knees that protest less at motion and more at stillness, and the silent way your body adapts to the work not as burden but as rhythm. Like tides pulled not by moonlight, but by muscle, memory, and the faint sense of being needed every single day. People don't call you by name much anymore. They call you him or the potman, or sometimes even just he, not in disrespect, but in the quiet shorthand of the familiar. The way city dwellers refer to landmarks that have always been there, immovable, unchanged, known by everyone and explained by no one. You hear it at the baths. He's cleaned that senator's villa, hasn't he? Or at the market. Ask him. He'll know which soap doesn't blister bronze. There's a kind of reputation that doesn't come with celebration, but with slow sediment. Layer upon layer of consistent, unremarkable presence, until people stop questioning your place and simply orbit around it. Like birds making wide circles above a warm rooftop, you've become a fixture, and strangely, the city treats you accordingly. The guards don't stop you anymore. The shopkeepers give a slight nod when you pass, even if you don't buy. Children don't heckle as much, at least not loudly. And when they do, it's more out of mischief than malice. And sometimes you catch them mimicking your motions with wooden spoons, laughing as they swirl puddles into imaginary pots, the way young boys play legionnaires with sticks for swords. You don't encourage them, but you don't stop them either. Part of you remembers what it felt like to imagine the world before knowing how much of it smells like sour vinegar and the underside of public stairs. Your hands are a study in contradiction now. Cracked but steady, swollen but precise, calloused in places where most men don't have skin thick enough to callous, and yet still sensitive enough to feel the grain of stone through a wet cloth. You've developed a way of holding pots that spares your wrists, a method of crouching that doesn't punish your knees, a pace that lets you finish without exhaustion, but all of it learned slowly, intuitively, without fanfare. And while the tools around you have changed, new buckets from the craftsman 2 streets over, a bristle blend from Numidia that doesn't shred on ironwork, even a waist sash that repels water after being dipped in some mystery oil sold by a traveling peddler. Your core routine remains untouched. You still begin with the wide rinse, still hum under your breath when you work alone, still end by tapping the side of the pot twice, once for completion, once for acknowledgement. The clients, too, have changed, or rather, rotated, just like the city itself. A few have died, their houses passed to sons who know nothing of basin etiquette or the difference between lye soap and ash slurry. Others have moved east or south or wherever the sea calls richer merchants. But in their place come newer households, young senators with more pride than sense, philosophers with unwashed hair and many opinions, retired gladiators who speak softly and walk with limps. Each one finds you because they always do, and within 3 visits, each has adapted to your way. Your pace, your silence, your refusal to haggle or flatter. You never promise perfection, only cleanliness, only consistency. And somehow, that's become enough. There's one house in particular that becomes a sort of turning point. Not because it's grander than the rest or stranger in its layout, but because of a girl. She's maybe 8 or 9, barefoot always, hair tied in uneven braids that look like they were done by wind or perhaps by her own impatient hands. She never speaks directly to you, but she watches. Every time you arrive, she's sitting on the step, pretending not to watch, pretending to be busy counting pebbles or feeding invisible birds. But her eyes follow every movement of your cloth, every swirl of the ladle, every careful scrape of bristle against ceramic. One day, you leave a broken-handled brush on the edge of the courtyard, too tired to carry it back, too aware that it's more splinter than tool now. The next week, you find it missing. And the week after that, you notice her sweeping the threshold with something suspiciously similar in shape, the brush wrapped in twine to hold the handle. She sees you see her, and for the first time she smiles, awkwardly, almost defiantly, like someone daring you to mock her. You don't. You simply nod once as if to say, "It's a start." That moment stays with you. Not because it changes anything grand or dramatic, but because it reminds you that the work, however grimy or overlooked, teaches. Not in sermons or speeches, but in motion, in silence, in the repeated act of doing a thing properly even when no one applauds it. You begin to wonder, in quiet stretches of time when the streets are still and the only sound is your ladle dipping water, whether that's all legacy really is. Not memory, not name, not monuments, but technique, passed down in gestures and choices, in what we allow the next hands to learn from ours. You've seen other trades forget this. Stonecutters who rush because the block must be done by sundown. Bakers who let the yeast sour because the oven was lit late. Even sweepers who push dust into corners rather than out the door. And you've seen the cost of those shortcuts. Walls that crack, bread that crumbles, streets that stink. But you've also seen what care can preserve. Bronze that shines despite its years. Clay that doesn't chip under heat. Dignity that survives in work done fully, even if it only lasts until the next use. There's a saying Morrow used to mutter before his back went bad and he retired to selling brushes on the corner. Clean pot, clean sleep. He meant it as a joke, but you've come to believe it's truer than he knew. There's a peace that comes from knowing the thing you touched is better now than when you found it. That the water you spilled washed away more than grime. You begin to sleep deeper. You begin to dream less of running and more of rinsing. You wake not with dread, but with habit, with a kind of calm that others mistake for detachment, but is, in truth, contentment. Some nights, when the stars are clear and the city noise fades into the lull of distant lyres and late drunk laughter, you sit by the same basin you started with and run your fingers along the rim, not to check for residue, but to remember the shape, the texture, the quiet transformation from filth to finish. And you realize that your work, your life, has become a kind of loop. Scrub, rinse, repeat, rest, rise, scrub again. But it's not a trap. It's a circle. And circles, unlike lines, have no end. You think of Publius less now. Not because you've stopped admiring him, but because you've stopped needing him to exist outside the idea. You understand now that every washer is a Publius if they carry the work with intention. That fame doesn't elevate the pot. Hands do, and your hands, worn though they are, still know exactly what to do. The rains come early that year, sneaking into Rome like a quiet guest who overstays their welcome. First as a gentle drizzle that settles into the mortar between roof tiles, then as steady sheets that soak tunics to the bone before a man's second step from cover, and finally, after the third day, as a cold, insistent downpour that turns alleyways into ankle-deep rivers and every basin left uncovered into a miniature lake, dotted with floating leaves, feathers, and more than one unfortunate beetle caught in the flood. You've lived through enough rainy seasons by now to know which walls leak, which stones become slick with moss, and which courtyards flood at the corner drain. So you navigate your rounds with a familiarity that borders on instinct, your body adapting in ways you don't even consciously register, your stride shortening to avoid slipping, your shoulders hunching ever so slightly forward, the satchel of dry cloths tucked higher beneath your tunic, your hands keeping your precious ladle wrapped in an oiled rag like it were a relic from some forgotten shrine. You don't mind the rain, not in itself. It washes the streets, softens the hardened messes in pots that haven't been touched in weeks, cools the fevered brick of summer's tale. What you do mind is the way people behave in the rain. Grumpier, more entitled, more impatient, as if the sky were doing it on purpose and someone needs to be blamed. Tempers flare. Instructions get barked instead of spoken. A senator's cook hurls a Chamberpot into the alley from the second story without even checking if anyone's passing below. You dodge it only by chance, the contents splattering beside you with a vengeance so foul it could raise the dead. You don't shout, don't protest. You just give the pot a long look as it rolls to a stop, then bend, pick it up, and carry on toward your station. Let others shout. Your hands have more to do than your tongue. Work becomes heavier too, not in effort necessarily, but in volume. The rain makes people linger indoors, and the more they linger, the more they use the pots, and the more they use them, the more they need you. There are days when you don't sit at all, moving from one door to another, rain drumming on your back like a constant tap of reminder. Rinse, 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 move on, and always with the same reliable tools. Your ladle now worn so smooth it shines like polished bone. Your cloth stitched with extra seams to hold together despite the soaking. Your brush replaced again just last month after the bristles started falling in clumps. You work through it all, not because you want to prove anything, but because this is simply what must be done. And you've long since stopped separating your identity from your actions. You are the work, and the work is you. In the evenings, if you have the energy, and sometimes even if you don't, you sit by your fireless hearth, ladle in hand, and inspect its edge for splinters, its bowl for warping. There's something meditative in the inspection, in the slow rotation of wood against calloused fingers, and you wonder, not for the first time, if your father used to do the same after you had fallen asleep all those years ago. You never asked him. You wish you had, not for the answer, but for the silence that would have followed, shared, heavy, respectful. That silence would have meant more than any lesson. It's during this season, when the Tiber rises and the days are a wash of gray and wet ochre, that the girl returns. Not the same one from the villa, but another, smaller, younger, thinner, with cheeks hollowed more by worry than by hunger, and with a presence that feels familiar before you even place her face. She's the niece of the baker, you realize, the one whose mother fell ill, who now runs errands with a seriousness far beyond her years. She appears at the edge of your usual cleaning courtyard one day, her feet bare and dirty, her arms wrapped around a pot nearly as wide as her chest. She says nothing, just stares at you as you scrub, then looks down at her own pot like it's a wounded animal she's unsure how to approach. You pause, say nothing, wait. Eventually she speaks. Can you show me? You don't answer. Not with words. Instead, you gesture to the edge of the basin, pull out your spare brush, the one with the half-worn bristles but still enough give, and nod once. She steps forward, careful not to slip on the wet stone, and kneels beside you, mimicking your posture. Her hands trembling slightly as she tries to hold the pot steady. The lesson begins. It isn't a dramatic teaching moment. No grand metaphors, no lectures, just action, repetition, correction, the quiet thud of brush against rim, the sigh of rinse water, the occasional hiss of rain against nearby bronze. You show her how to tilt the pot to avoid splashing, how to scrub in circles instead of lines, how to let the water soak first before scraping. Her arms are weak, her grip uneven, but her focus is intense. Her brow furrowed with the kind of effort that doesn't need encouragement. It's already burning hot inside her. You recognize that fire. You remember what it felt like when your hands first found rhythm. She returns the next day, and the next. Sometimes with her own pot, sometimes just to watch. You don't ask questions. She doesn't offer explanations. It's not about names or stories. It's about practice, about continuity, about one set of hands learning from another. Not through theory, but through soaked sleeves and sore wrists and the strange satisfaction of a pot that gleams after 30 minutes of stubborn scrubbing. One afternoon, as the rain momentarily lets up and the clouds break just enough for a sliver of sunlight to touch the wet courtyard stone, she lifts her pot with a grunt and says, unprompted, "I think I did it right." You inspect it, turning it slowly, noting the even texture, the lack of leftover film at the edges. You nod just once. She smiles, teeth crooked, eyes bright, and for the first time in weeks, you feel something rise in your chest. Not pride exactly, and certainly not joy, but something deeper, quieter, like a ripple in still water. Later that week, she carves something into the side of her brush handle, a tiny symbol, not letters, just a curl and a crosshatch. And when you ask her what it means, she shrugs and says, "It's mine." And you understand. The rains eventually ease, as they always do, and the city begins to dry. The streets smell like warm stone again, and the laundry lines return to life, flapping lazily above the alleyways. Your knees ache a little more than they used to. Your fingers sometimes stiffen in the cold, refusing to curl all the way unless coaxed gently. But the work goes on. And now, occasionally, you have a shadow. The girl, silent, focused, curious, moves beside you, learning not just how to clean, but how to carry herself in the face of being unseen. And it strikes you, in the middle of one quiet morning, that legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you pass on while still here. It's not stories. It's habits, motions, a way of moving through the world without needing permission. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. By the time your knees begin to crackle like old parchment whenever you squat to lift a pot, and your knuckles thicken with the slow, creeping grip of time that no amount of oil or vinegar can ease, the city around you has grown both unfamiliar and exactly the same. New voices shout from old balconies. Different dogs chase the same carts down the same alleyways, and a fresh crop of sandal-footed youth now loiters where you once stood, watching the steam rise from the baker's kiln with the kind of idle hunger that only the truly poor or eternally hopeful can muster. You no longer rush. You no longer need to. People wait for you now, not out of deference, but because you have become part of their timing, like the toll of the temple bell or the arrival of the barley cart. They know you'll come. They know you'll finish. And they know that when you leave, the job will be done right. There's a dignity in that kind of expectation. Not the loud, honorific kind that comes with applause or statues, but the quiet, steady kind that settles over years, like dust on a shelf that no one dares wipe away because it feels too permanent, too earned. You are not a relic, but you are a fixture. And sometimes, when the sun hits the stone just right and casts a long shadow behind you as you walk, you catch a glimpse of your silhouette and see not the boy you once were, not the wiry apprentice with the sore back and the stubborn hands, but a version of yourself that has grown larger, not in size, but in stillness, in certainty, in the kind of presence that doesn't need announcement. You still clean pots. Of course you do. You always have. But there's a rhythm now that goes beyond muscle, beyond method. It's in your bones, in your breath, in the way you lean slightly left when lifting, the way you tap the rim twice after rinsing, the way you line the cloths on the stones to dry in perfect order. Not because anyone's watching, but because disorder offends something deep inside you now. You've become a keeper of tiny rituals, and the rituals have kept you in return. And the girl, no longer a girl, truly, but not quite a woman yet. Her shoulders still narrow, but her grip now sure. She walks beside you some days, matching your pace not because she must, but because she chooses to. You don't speak much as you work together. Words would only break the spell. But her hands move the way yours once did, tentative and then firm, uncertain and then precise. And you feel a strange warmth at watching someone else take the motions you spent decades perfecting and wear them like second skin. She's still learning, still misses spots near the base, still scrubs too hard on bronze, not enough on terracotta. But she listens. She watches. She improves. One day, after a particularly grueling round of courtyard pots left out too long in the sun, their contents dried into stubborn crusts, she sets down her brush and says, "This isn't a job. It's a rhythm." And you don't answer, because there's nothing more to say. She's understood. And once someone understands that truly and wholly, they no longer need teaching. You find yourself handing off more tasks to her. Not because you're tired, although you are, and not because you're slowing down, although that too, but because watching her work reminds you that you are not the final link in this chain. You're simply a strong one, maybe stronger than most, but still a link. Still part of something older and bigger and more enduring than any single pair of hands. Sometimes, when the air is particularly still and the light filters through the fabric canopy in the plaza like sifted flour, you remember your father, not his face, which time has blurred around the edges, but his hands, his voice, his silences. You remember the way he tied the rag around the brush handle twice, always twice. You remember the way he sighed before lifting the bucket. You remember that once, just once, he looked at you and said, "Don't ever rush a rinse. That's where the truth hides." And you hadn't understood it then. But now, after hundreds, no, thousands of rinses, you know he wasn't talking about soap or water. He was talking about care, about the way we reveal ourselves in the quiet parts of our work. And so you rinse slowly, always. People call you old man now, when they refer to you at all. It doesn't bother you. In Rome, old means enduring, and enduring means respected. Even the rowdy ones, the loud youths with too many rings and too few manners, they quiet their tone when you pass. Not out of fear, but out of something older than etiquette, something ancestral. They see the stoop in your back, the stains that don't wash out of your tunic no matter how many times you beat it against the river stones. And they recognize a kind of power that doesn't need shouting. The girl, her name is Livia, though you rarely use it, has begun taking solo rounds. You let her. Of course you do. The first time she asks, you pretend to hesitate. But really, the decision was made the moment you noticed she stopped needing correction. She comes back tired, but not broken. A little proud, though she tries to hide it. Her pot is clean, her hands blistered, her eyes shining. You nod. She says nothing. That is the ceremony. A few days later, you catch her carving something small into her ladle handle. Something not unlike what you once saw in your father's tools. A pattern, not a name, but a mark. A way of saying this is mine, and I know what I am doing. You ask what it means. She shrugs. Balance, she says. And you nod again. Because she's right. The city does not notice. The city never does. Rome goes on, as it always has, loud and sprawling and indifferent. But you notice. You notice the way she stops to check a rim with her fingertip, not her eyes. You notice the way she hums while drying. You notice that one day you forget your cloth and she has an extra already folded. You are not gone yet, not fading, not retreating, but you are sharing. For the first time in your life, the work feels less like something you must carry and more like something you can hand over. And the moment that thought occurs to you, not in words, but in feeling, you realize that the end is not something to fear. It's simply the next step in the rhythm. And so you clean, still, but slower, with more pause between motions, more breath between steps. And Livia matches you, not out of sympathy, but out of respect. One morning, as the birds begin their frantic pre-dawn chorus, and the streets still smell like last night's rain and half-swept olive pits, she turns to you and asks, "Do you think they'll still need this in 50 years?" And you smile, not because it's a foolish question, but because it's the question you once asked, so long ago that it might have been in a different life. You don't answer her directly. You say, "As long as there are people, there will be mess." And that's enough. She nods. She understands. And together, you lift the day's first pot. The last years do not come with trumpets or omens or any dramatic sunset fading into symbolic twilight. They arrive as quietly and gradually as the wrinkles that have long since mapped your knuckles. as subtly as the wear on your ladle's handle, as gently as the mist that sometimes lingers over the city in the early morning. When Rome feels half awake, and the silence is a kind of gift you've learned to treasure. For in that brief hour between the shadows retreating and the full bustle of the day, you feel most in step with yourself, most aware that you are still here, still useful, still moving forward, even if more slowly now. Even if the climb up the slope behind the wool market makes your legs tremble and your breath grow short and ragged in a way that once would have embarrassed you. But not anymore, because there is a peace that comes with age, a quiet refusal to rush, to please, to impress. Livia does more now, most of it, truth be told, and you allow it not out of laziness or fatigue, though both sometimes catch you unaware like sudden gusts of wind, but because you trust her. Not in the vague way people say they trust someone when they mean to be kind, but in the deep, marrow-level way that only happens when someone has proved, again and again, not just that they can follow instructions, but that they see what you see. Notice the same flaws, the same residues, the same points where soap alone won't reach, and the brush must be turned just so. Angled in the wrist, like you once taught her, and where, above all, care must be taken not just with the pot, but with how the pot is left. Dried properly, placed securely, always returned to its place. Not because someone said to, but because it matters. There's a kind of strange joy in watching yourself fade, if that makes any sense at all. Not because you disappear, not because you're being forgotten, but because what you were is being absorbed, transferred, echoed back to you in someone else's hands, someone else's eyes, someone else's rhythms, and it feels not like an ending, but like water finding a new channel, a new basin, still flowing, still moving, but shaped differently now. More gently, more softly. You begin to keep different hours. You wake earlier, sometimes before the first light, and just sit for a while, wrapped in your thin wool cloak, listening to the sounds of the city breathing, dogs scratching, carts rattling in the distance, a rooster crowing as if the sun needed reminding. And in those moments, you think about things you never had time for before. About your father. About that cracked pot from the Domitian house that you swore would never come clean, but somehow did. About the way Livia rolls her sleeves twice at the wrist like you do. And how she whistles, low and tuneless, just like you used to when you thought no one was listening. There's a little boy who lives in the neighboring house now, barely old enough to form full sentences, but full of questions nonetheless. And he takes a fascination with your brush, always watching from the doorway, never quite bold enough to approach, until one afternoon when the street is especially quiet and Livia's off running an errand. He tiptoes over and asks, "Is it true you made pots clean with just that?" And you, amused, hold out the brush like a sacred relic and say, "With this, and a lot of elbow." He looks confused. You laugh softly. He runs off. The seasons change, as they always do. Summer gives way to cool breezes that carry the scent of crushed grapes and burnt fig leaves. Winter creeps in with its stiff winds and crackling joints. Livia begins to bring you hot broth without asking. You begin to sit more than scrub. But you're still there. Always. A presence. A witness. A a steadying force. There is one day, a particularly bright day in spring, when she comes to you, her brow furrowed not with confusion, but with intention, and says, "I've been offered work at the villa near the aqueduct, full time, keeping the whole place, not just the pots." And though your heart lurches, though your mouth wants to ask, "Will you leave the trade?" you nod slowly, knowing that this is the very purpose of all those hours beside the basin, all those quiet mornings of instruction and repetition, and the 1,000 tiny corrections that shaped her hands into something strong and useful. "You should take it," you say, and she kneels, the way apprentices do, and she says, "Only if I can still come here sometimes." You smile, and that is enough. The next few months pass gently, like pages in a well-read scroll, the corners soft, the ink fading but still legible. You spend more time watching than doing. Your tools are used more by others now, but they are still yours, still marked by your hands, still part of you. And you realize, finally, that you do not fear being forgotten. Not because you'll be remembered in stories or songs, you won't, but because you will remain in habits, in methods, in choices. You will endure in the way Livia lifts the basin, in the way the boy next door imitates your scrubbing with a stick and a bucket of rainwater, in the quiet discipline of the craft. One morning, you wake and your body does not want to rise, not out of pain, not out of weariness, but because it knows. It simply knows. You sit for a long time, longer than usual. The light slants differently through the window, warm and golden and strangely still. You hold your ladle, your first one, the one you no longer use but kept anyway, with the split in the handle and the stain at the rim. And you think, not about what you didn't do, but about what you did. You cleaned, you cared, and that was enough. You close your eyes, and you rest. So, if your breathing has slowed and your thoughts have softened, that's just right. Let yourself drift a little further now, into that calm, slow-moving space where there's no work to be done and no pots to rinse. Only the sound of rain tapping gently on tiled roofs, and the scent of wet stone after a long summer day. You've walked through a lifetime, through dust and dawns and drizzles and dusk, and you've done it not with grandeur or noise, but with presence, with care, with quiet resilience that didn't ask for praise, just purpose. And even now, in this soft twilight of the story, there's a rhythm still gently echoing, like the slow swirl of water in a basin, or the last hum of a tune forgotten long ago, but somehow remembered by your hands. Let that rhythm carry you now, as the world around you fades into stillness. Imagine the warmth of the Roman sun on your back, the weight of a clean cloth folded neatly beside you, the quiet pride of a task well done, a life well lived. There is nothing left to scrub, nothing left to carry, only rest, only peace, only the hush that follows a day completed with care. So breathe deeply and let go. You are home,